Thank you for participating in this course. It's a single credit course on comparative study of human rights. We have with us Professor Adam DUBIN. He's from the University of Madrid. Essentially, he'll be introducing himself. He has got a wide variety of experience in teaching of human rights. He's been to various countries doing it, and he hopes to have a very interactive session with you. He'll be spending nearly 15 hours with all of you, maybe more, if you can drag it out. The booklet, the study material and the assignments will be supplied to you in a short while. So he'll be starting with a short interaction. The main I'm not the coordinator of the course. It's Dr. Kavita Singh who is the coordinator of the course. I just take care of the logistics part. So if your attendance register is not done, it's me. But if the class is not happening, it's Kavita. If the class is not happening, it's Adam. It's not on me. If you do not have water, that's on me. Alright? So Kavita will be here in a while. I'll just hand over the podium to Adam. He will then start the class. You will have your assessment, that's your evaluation, on the last day. The model of assessment, the evaluation of it, the pattern of questions, all of these things will be decided by Adam. Once he scores the marks, we will be giving you on the certificate. So please be sure to have good marks, because each one of you will have to go and give it back to your university, put it on your CVs, whatever purpose you require it for. So be attentive, don't get intimidated by the reading material. It's a little bit huge, it's a bit big in size, but it's worth it. I'm quite confident of it. Over to you, Adam.
Thank you. All right, how are we? Good? Everyone's good? So this is comparative statistical analysis, right? No, I'm just kidding. This is international human rights, a comparative regional analysis, and as Vanita said, I'm Adam DUBIN. I'm a law professor at Universidad Pontificia COMILLAS in Madrid, Spain. Has anyone been to Madrid, Spain? Or to Spain? Okay, you've been. All right, where were you? Where? Ibiza. Oh, the island. Oh, that's very nice. Okay.
For my paternal uncle's land.
Ah, all right. Well, very nice, very nice. So, anyway, that is where I teach, though you might tell from the accent that I'm not originally from Spain. I'm originally from New York City, where I grew up, but I moved to Spain some years ago, out of love, mainly. For the country and for the person I'm married to. And I've been residing there for quite some time. I started my teaching with New York University. Has anyone heard of NYU? And actually, NYU has a small campus in Madrid. And I teach there a course on comparative human rights. And I also teach a course there on international development and law. Just to give you a little bit of background on me, apart from that. So my field is largely human rights, particularly in the area of sub-Saharan Africa. I did my doctoral thesis on access to justice and human rights for sex workers in Kampala, Uganda. A very, very specific topic. And before going into academia, I spent some time working in Cambodia with a fellowship, where I worked for the United Nations Genocide Tribunal there. I was with the UN prosecution. And then later, I moved and I lived for some time in New Delhi, where I worked on for an organization called the Human Rights Law Network, with someone named Colin Gonsalves. I don't know if anyone has heard of him, a well-known senior advocate here in India. I did a lot of work there on gender litigation. Yeah. Although now I work as a full-time professor, I still keep one foot in the real world. I do some consulting here and there. I was just about 3 weeks ago. I was in Angola. I do work there on children's rights, training judges and lawyers on how to implement the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Yeah, and I've done some work in Uganda, Kenya, and a number of other countries around the world. So that's a little bit about me. Hopefully, I'll talk about the course in a little bit, but hopefully, through this course, you won't just get sort of a theoretical understanding of these questions, but also a practical understanding. Because at the end of the day, human rights is about humans, right? We could read books. We could read. This is all for tomorrow, by the way. No, I'm just kidding. We can read articles. We can read, but at the end of the day, when we talk about human rights, we're talking about the protection of humans. I sometimes think that it extends to my dog. My wife tells me that no, he doesn't have the same rights as everyone else. I beg to disagree, but in any case, what we're talking about is humans. And at the end of the day, human rights has to be practical. Because the moment it becomes abstract theory is the moment we face challenges in defending people's basic dignity, right? So anyway, I'll talk about the course in a moment. Does anyone have any questions? Anything? No? Nothing up to now? Okay. So let me talk about the course, and then if people don't mind, I would just love for people to quickly introduce themselves. I know there are many of us here, but I'd love to know who is sitting in front of me, if you have any background in human rights, anything you want to tell me about yourself. I'd love to know about you, yeah? Another thing is that hopefully this class will be participative. Sort of boring listening to me for 3 hours straight. So, I'm happy to call on people. I'm happy to have people participate. In the United States, we use what's called has anyone studied in the United States in a law school there? We use the Socratic method, meaning I'm sort of the director of the orchestra, but you guys are the ones playing the instruments. So, hopefully together with my approach and then your participation, we can search for answers, and also we can inter-exchange experiences, because I know, certainly the European part and the American part, but what I know less is the Indian part. So what I'd like for this is to really triangulate it between my knowledge, the American and the European part, along with what you can share about the Indian aspect of human rights protection. And as I said, I'd love to get to know you guys. If people afterwards want to continue the discussion, I'm certainly happy to go and have a tea before or after and continue talking about these questions. So certainly feel free afterwards to come up to me and we can continue talking about what will hopefully be interesting questions. Question for you: am I talking too quickly? No? Okay. Sometimes people say that I talk to, in New York City we tend to speak kind of quickly. In the South, like in Alabama, not as much. But if I speak too quickly, just tell me, and I will. I'll slow down. And everyone can hear me, okay? Yeah. All right. Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about this class. Yeah. So the title of it is International Human Rights: A Comparative Regional Analysis. What we'll start off by doing, since I think not everyone has everyone here studied human rights? No. Okay. So some people yes, some people no. So what we'll do today, basically, and into tomorrow, is we'll talk about human rights generally. We'll talk about what human rights are, how we interpret them, what the obligations of the states are, all of that information into the jurisprudence and everything, without first making sure we all have the same level. Yeah. So that's what we'll do. Talking about some regional perspectives on human rights, maybe a little bit today, but if not, tomorrow. And I'll do 3 presentations. One on human rights in Africa, another one on human rights in the Americas, including the United States, which you can imagine these days with Mr. Trump is a little problematic. Number 1, the mechanisms to protect human rights. Number 2, the treaties, or the Constitution in some cases, that protect human rights. And then 3, we'll talk about what are the big human rights issues. Africa and the Americas have different human rights issues than Europe, for example. So I'll give you a little bit of a presentation on what I think are some of, not all of, but some of the biggest human rights problems that each of those regions face. And then we can also talk a little bit about India as well, if people would like to compare and contrast. We'll also talk about tomorrow, because I want you to read it first, the concept of what's called American exceptionalism. That is that America loves to talk about human rights. They love, United States I'm referring to now, they love to talk about human rights. They love to say, Iraq, you didn't sign, you violate human rights, we're gonna go to war with Iraq. No, that was the real reason. But the United States doesn't sign any human rights treaties. It doesn't even include, oftentimes, in its own legislation, human rights norms. The Supreme Court of the United States often says, get this crappy international stuff out of my courtroom, right? So the question is why? Why does America talk a big game about human rights, but then it doesn't actually always do that much on it, right? Or it doesn't sign, it doesn't meet its international obligations, yeah? So that's what we'll do through tomorrow. Then Saturday, I don't think we'll get to it tomorrow. Saturday, we'll start talking about freedom of expression. We'll spend about 1 or 2 days on freedom of expression. I'll tell you beforehand which cases to read. Not every single one is here, so I'll just clarify to you which ones to read. We'll talk about freedom of expression, and we'll compare jurisprudence between the United States and Europe. I think that's oftentimes where you see the biggest differences in terms of interpretation. Yeah. So that's what we'll do. Then after that, we'll talk about freedom of expression, but in relationship not to hate speech, which is we'll start out talking about hate speech. Yeah. But we'll switch and we'll talk about the question of what's called freedom of press, and then also what are called time, place, and manner restrictions. Yeah, that is, when can we restrict the time, place, and manner of of someone's speech. We'll also look at a really interesting video, one of my favorite videos, produced by Duke University. Has anyone heard of Duke University in North Carolina? And it's a video that I love to show and I love to watch. It's about a Ku Klux Klan. Have people heard of the Ku Klux Klan? They were involved in the South of the United States with hanging African Americans, with killing them. They still exist in the United States, but not like before. Anyway, we're going to watch a short video. It's an interview with, we're going to read the case called Virginia v. Black, and we'll watch the video of an interview with a Ku Klux Klan member who was arrested for lighting a cross and well, for a few things. And then we'll listen to the interview with his lawyer, who is black. Really interesting case, and it really highlights, I think, sort of the American approach to freedom of expression. Then after that, we'll switch and we'll look at the issue of freedom of religion. Again, comparing the jurisprudence from the United States and Europe. By the way, all of this is in this book, so you will you'll have it all. And that is, I think, particularly interesting in light of what's happening in Europe. There's a big migratory flow from Syria, from Iraq, from Northern Africa into European countries, and countries that have traditionally been quite homogenous. No, for example, Spain, which is quite Catholic; Italy, which is quite Catholic; France, which is secular more. They're faced with questions about integration and religious integration. So we'll look at those questions as well. We'll look specifically at an interesting case that you may have heard of, where it was prohibited to wear headscarves in France. Yeah, and we'll compare that to something similar in America. And again, we're not just going to comment on it, but I would like us to opine on it, to talk about this, whether we think the reasoning of these cases is correct, whether we think it's incorrect. This is an academic institution, and all opinions are certainly welcome here. Yeah, and then we'll look at the question of the establishment of religion. To what extent can states in Europe, and in the case of the United States, to what extent can there be an establishment of religion? Now, we know in the United States that the establishment of any religion is illegal. But what about when you go to court and you put your hand on the Bible and you say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, so help me God, right? Or what about, what about a church organization using a public school to have meetings? can they do that, right? So we'll look at those questions, and then we'll compare it to Europe, where there's more involvement of religion in the state. For example, in a public school, can they put a cross in a public school? Anyway, we'll look at those questions. After that, we'll look at the issue of sexual orientation, LGBT rights. We'll look at it from the United States, how the United States analyzes these questions of LGBT rights. And now is an interesting time to do it because there's a lot of interesting things happening in the United States. One is, 2 years ago, the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage across the United States. We'll read that case here. But right now, going on, they just had the argument yesterday, I believe, in the Supreme Court. There's a case going on. We don't have a decision yet, but the question is, there's a cake maker have people heard of this case? There's a cake maker in Colorado who refused to make a cake for a homosexual couple in Colorado for their wedding. The question then is, can he refuse to do that? So we'll look at those questions. After that, we'll switch to women's rights, and we'll look at the issue of abortion. We'll look at 2 cases in the United States, and then we'll look at a case from Europe, a case from Ireland on abortion rights. And then we'll end with the issue of cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment. We'll look at how the United States deals with the question of cruel and unusual punishment and torture and so on. And then we'll look at the case, some cases in Europe. One of my favorite cases, we'll look at the case called Soaring versus the United Kingdom. And it's about a German man who married or was dating a woman from Virginia in the United States. He ended up killing his in-laws and then fleeing back to, not Germany, but to the United Kingdom. And it'll tell us about issues of death row and so on. So that is basically, that's going to be the course. We have a lot of material to get through. In terms of reading, I know it's a lot. Do the best you can. When you read the cases are quite dense. You can skip through a lot of the procedural stuff. What I really want you to get from the cases is what are the facts and what are the holdings. There's a lot of background information in the cases, and in my opinion, it's not necessary. Yeah. So, pick and choose what you want. But what you should take out of every reading is basically what are the facts and how did the judge or judges, how did they reason these questions? Yeah. Is that clear? And then actually, one thing I didn't say is depending on how we're doing with time, if we get through cases quickly or not, what I thought we would do maybe the second half of the last class is I supervise our human rights moot court team in Spain. It's a European-wide case. I've done it for the last three years. No, now this is the 4th year. And I thought I would maybe, after we've looked through all this jurisprudence, maybe bring in a case. And although there are many of us, we could work to litigate the case together. We think about the arguments, the counter-arguments. I could give you some of the jurisprudence beforehand, so that way you could also read it, and then we can have an interesting, again, depending on how we're doing with time, or if people really want to do it, we could also find another time. Anyway, we can play it by ear. Yeah, so that's basically the course. We don't have that much time together, so we cover, I think, a decent amount of material. At least it'll give you a general understanding of these questions, of how human rights is understood at the international level, the regional level, and then at the state level as well. As I said, do as much reading as you can. I understand that there is a lot, so whatever you can read is appreciated. So if people don't mind, I know there are many of us, but if we could just very briefly tell me who you are, what university you're from, what you're studying, anything you want to tell me about you, I'm happy to listen. So maybe we start.
Good afternoon. Myself, Navonita Banerjee. I'm a PhD research scholar in this university, and my topic is very much related to human rights. It's gender discrimination in elementary education in West Bengal. And I happen to be the secretary to an NGO also, which also works on this field.
Right,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Achin Jana. I'm an advocate of Calcutta High Court and presently doing PhD from this institute. So my topic is DNA fingerprinting and its impact on the human rights.
All right, good. Well, very nice.
We're looking forward to the lectures.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good, that's interesting.
Hello, I'm Shrita Rai Chaudhary from the Department of Law, University. I'm a 5th year student and I want to do LLM in Human Rights Law, so I look forward to doing it.
Good afternoon everyone, I'm Aishwarya Dev and I'm a Masters of Law student at Nalsara University of Law, Hyderabad, and I'm also doing a postgraduate diploma in International Humanitarian Law, so I'm looking forward to this session. Thank you. Good afternoon, I'm Shal Bala and I'm from Department of Law as well, and I'm a 3rd year student, and I interned in Human Rights Law Network in my 2nd year, and so I'm looking forward to know more about this.
It's Human Rights Law Network.
Human Rights Law Network, Ranchi.
Oh, okay. With Cullen Gonsalves, is it the same?
Sorry, sir?
The Delhi organization?
No, sir.
A different
It
one.
was in Ranchi, Jharkhand.
Okay. Welcome. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rupa Singh. I'm from Department of Law, Calcutta University, 3rd year.
Thanks.
Good afternoon, my name is Disha Chakraborty. I'm a 2nd year student from this very university. Human rights interests me a lot, so I'm really looking forward to this course.
Hello, I'm Srija Pal. I'm also a 2nd year student of this university, studying the ALLB, and yes, looking forward to your course, sir.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Anamika. I'm a student, 2nd year in National Law University, Orissa.
Hi, I'm Shreya. I'm from National Law University, Orissa.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rishit Singh. I'm a 3rd year student of law, looking to learn.
Good afternoon. My name is Gaurav, and I'm studying LLB from Kingston Law College, 3rd year.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dev Krishnan. I'm a second year student of BLLB from University of Law.
What is the issue for humanitarian law? I am Debango Goswami, I'm a student of
My name is Devanshu Chakraborty. I'm pursuing a PLLB from Calcutta University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kavita. I am a 4th year law student from NUHS. And as regards the human rights, I have done an internship in National Human Rights Commission in Delhi. So that's why I'm here for the course.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Shivani, a 4th year law student from the Katz Convention.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Achita. I'm from Calcutta University.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm from the University from 4th year pursuing BBA.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sanjay Pratap Singh, and I'm a 4th year law student from the UNIVERSITY.
Good afternoon, my name is Vijay, and I'm also from the UNIVERSITY.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am
I'm Chayanti Das from Alira Law College, Fortis.
I'm Monica Sutri. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rahul Jaiswal. I'm from Calcutta.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Rekha Mara. I'm from Gian University, Greater Noida, and I have done an internship in UP Human Rights Commission and looking forward to do an internship in National Human Rights Commission also. We have just completed international law, so because of that, I'm interested in human rights. So basically, that is why I'm looking forward to it. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Devajita. I'm a 4th year law student from South Calcutta Law College, and I had done a course in Indian Society of International Law in Delhi. So human rights
speak with you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Rushi from second year Cedaw Law School. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is a second year student from Cedaw Law School. I pursued a course on international humanitarian law from Belarus International Law Association. So that is what it is.
Myself is Sonali from Cedaw.
Good afternoon, my name is Shanika. We are from
Good
afternoon, my name is Prashant Mishra, graduate student of University. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Piyush Chandra. I am an advocate by profession. I have completed my PhD in nuclear law.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shivan Ghosh. I am a PhD scholar in this very university. I have done my post-graduation in human rights only and Cedaw.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. This is Pratham Shah from Muslim University. Human rights, no doubt, is a wide sense, and I'm in second year DLLB course, and this is an initial stage for me. I'm new to this course. I'm not known much about it, but I hope that I'm a bit optimistic about that. I'll be gaining a lot after this course. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kamran Fadil from Muslim University, and I'm looking forward for the human rights of the detainers. And I'm the fourth year law.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katz Convention, and I am from Muslim University, Department of
Welcome.
Myself, Kumar. I'm a faculty, Christ University, Bangalore. I'm specialist in constitutional and human rights, presently handling constitutional law and media law. I'm glad that you're going to speak about freedom of expression, press, as well as hate speech.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Which university are you from?
Christ University, Bangalore.
Okay.
Good afternoon, I'm Prof. Keswani, and I'm a first year learner at Symbiosis Law School, Noida.
Good afternoon, Noida. Myself, Mohammad Ghalib Shahid, pursuing third year LLB from Siddhartha Law College, Vijayawada, Andhra Pradesh. Apart from that, I am pursuing PG Diploma in Human Rights from Delhi, IAHR. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Srinivas. I'm from the Customary Law.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shreya. I am pursuing my doctorate in Synthesis, Hyderabad. Good morning, everybody. I am Shrestha. I am from Kolkata. I am also pursuing the LLB course of 5 years from Symbiosis Law School, Hyderabad as well. I don't have much depth about this topic, but then since it interests me much, that's why I'm here. And like I said, good evening, everyone. I'm Shreya Ghotasida. I'm pursuing DALB. I'm a second year student of Symbiosis International University.
Good evening, I'm Nisha Srivastava, first year student from Symbiosis Hyderabad.
Hello, everybody. This is Mansi Sharma from Belgoria's University, fourth year student.
Hello everyone, good afternoon. I am Priyanka and I am from Kerala University, first year. My name is Pritisha. I am a LLB student.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Orji Gupta. I'm from Kerala University, first year. Good afternoon, myself, Sri Spartan. I'm from Calcutta University, fourth year student.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good to have you here. My name is Durga Khetan. I'm serving as a district judge in West Bengal. For me, human rights is like, because everybody is speaking about the subject, I don't know much about it. My only idea is whenever I try to understand it, it looks like a vanishing point of all law. So I'm very intrigued by it, and that brings me here. Thanks for coming to this. Thank you.
hello everyone. I'm Vidhi Sharma and I'm a second year law student. Hello, I'm Sonika Bush from Loyola College, Greater Noida. I did a course on medical law in which there was this human right concept. So I like that very much. I'm looking forward to this course.
Good afternoon, I am Sakshi Poddar from Chanakya National Law University, second year.
Good afternoon, sir. I am Arunava Singh, I'm a second year BLLB student from Chanakya National Law University.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Diksha, and I'm a fourth year law student of Wbnujs University. Well, I haven't done much with human rights, but I believe that being a human, I should have knowledge about my rights across the globe. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Rajiv Kumar Jha. I am pursuing my BBA LLB from Galgotias University. I am member volunteer of Youth for Human Rights organization. It's an international organization which works for the human rights, so awareness and many more. So,
Hello, sir. I'm Sonia from Galgotias University, Greater Noida.
My name is Singh. I'm also a third year law student from School of Law, Greater Noida University. School of Law, Galgotias University. I did my internship in first year in an NGO in Kolkata, where it safeguarded the interests of the children of the sex workers. So that intrigued me a lot. Sir, I have a question also related to the topic. So, all the issues that are being dealt, why it is being dealt from the perspective of the United States?
Why does what?
In the perspective, whatever we are dealing with issues right now, in the international human rights which you discussed, why it is mostly from the perspective of the United States?
Because it's a big country, and because it offers some jurisprudence that's quite different from a lot of the rest of the world. The notions of, you'll see, but the notions of freedom of expression, freedom of religion are quite unique from a U.S. perspective. So that's why. Thank you so much.
Very good afternoon to all of you. My name is Swati Singh, pursuing BBA LLB, fourth year student from Galgotias University. And today I'm come here to attend this course because one, I'm a volunteer in YHRI as well. Then second, I'm a member of many NGOs as well. So I know that human rights are the very basic one and we should have a knowledge about it. Because studying law without knowing human rights is, I think, sugar without, tea without sugar. So, thank you.
Hello everyone, I am Mohin Roy. I am from Galgotias University, Greater Noida. I am fourth year law student. Hello everyone, I am Hello sir. And I want to be international diplomat, and that is the thing that comes with related to international human rights. So I want to respect this.
You're a diplomat?
No, I want to be.
Okay. Good.
Hello everyone, I am Vivek Pandey. I am from second year. Good afternoon everyone.
I am a second year law student. Myself, Suman Kumar, myself. I am from Kavita.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kumari Nishi from South Kolkata Law College.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Gaurav Kumar. I am a senior law student of Kavita.
Friends, myself Alok Kavana from Bihar Institute of Law. I am a core member of Wbnujs Army, which is working for the upliftment of poor people, and it will help for me to understand the basic rights for the poor people. Thank you so much.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Yash from BBA LLB, Galgotias University, third year.
Myself Aditi, I am from Galgotias University, fourth year. I have already interned at a human rights law network, and I am interested in this course because of my inclination towards the rights of sex workers.
My name is Debarista. I'm a third year student of Chanakya National Law University.
All right, good. Did we miss anyone? All right, so quite a lot of geographic diversity here, no? From all over India, no? It seems, at least from many places, which is good for our purposes, in that I think we can hopefully all share different experiences, different opinions. And I don't know whether it's the case in India, but certainly in the United States, the view of human rights coming from New York City, for example, is different than the view of rights coming from Texas, right? I don't know whether there are similar differences here within India. Yeah? Yeah. Okay, good. So hopefully we can draw on those differences and have some interesting conversation. So let's then talk about... hold on a second. Okay, wait, hold on. It doesn't stay. Just very quickly, so as I said, this is my university here. This is my email address. If anyone needs to write me an email, wants to talk more, I'm happy to. So, sorry? Ah, back. Yes. Yeah, good? Okay, so let's, before we even define human rights, let's start with a question. I wrote a book some years ago, denying the Holocaust. Everyone know the Holocaust? Yeah, they said that 6 million people died. Total lie, never happened. Is that a problem that I deny the Holocaust? It's a problem, no? Can I be arrested for denying the Holocaust? But what about in Germany, where there's a law that says I can't deny the Holocaust? What about, for example, in the Netherlands, where what about in the United Kingdom, where, for example, I can't put a picture of, on my window that says Muslims out of England? Can I do that in England? No. Okay, another question. Can I, in the United States, say all African Americans should be put back into slavery? Yes, I can. I can. So, that brings up the question. Is all of what I'm saying expression? It's expression, right? It's opinion, it's my own expression, right? Expression can be symbolic, it could be oral, I could do an interpretive dance. All of that is expression. So, what then can we sort of pull apart is the problem with expression? Or with human rights generally? Let's just not say expression, let's say generally. What is clearly an issue here? Okay, but in the United States, I could certainly, we had, 200 or 300 years of slavery, worst conditions any of us could imagine. Yet I could go and say, all blacks should be put back in slavery. I could say that, no? I could certainly, I could say that I think all Jewish people should be sent back to concentration camps. I could say that, no?
You are entitled to your intolerance. You are entitled to your intolerance. At the same time, we have to have this idea of not to hurt.
But is there a right not to be hurt?
Of course, that's where human rights comes in, no?
Well, does it? In the United States, could I say to a group of African Americans, you should all be put back into slavery? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We'll see in a moment. We'll see. Now, but could I, in Germany, give the Sieg Heil? Everyone know the Sieg Heil, the Hitler sign? Can I do that? No. So we get two very different ideas. First of all, I don't believe anything I just said. I didn't write any books, just to be very clear. A few years ago when I was teaching in the law school, I said the same thing, and this student, he was in the last row, he raises his hand, he says to me, "You're absolutely right, I agree that the Holocaust never happened." And I said, "Well, you better just stay in the back row." Obviously, I don't believe anything that I just said, but I do it to highlight the complexity of human rights, right? That although we think we know freedom of expression, freedom of religion, cruel and unusual punishment, at the end of the day, human rights is much more complex than that, right? And we have to understand country contexts, histories, ethnical, cultural questions, if we're going to fully understand human rights. Although I don't deny that in Spain I have freedom of expression, I certainly do, but within certain limits. Does someone in France have freedom of religion? Well, according to the French government, they do. According to the US, probably not. So what we're going to do in this class is really question what is the basis of freedom of expression, or of human rights, which is universality. That is, although we're going to look at over the next day or two what are human rights, how we define them, that's only one step, I think, of the puzzle. The second step is understanding, once we've taken these international human rights norms, once we understand how the UN functions, the question then becomes, okay, how do we implement them in a country? And what are the complexities? What are the peculiarities that make human rights such a complex concept? So let's begin by first trying to define what are human rights. Anyone want to try? What are human rights? Anyone?
Anything and everything, starting from taxation to sanitation.
Okay, so starting from taxation
to sanitation.
But taxation in what sense?
I mean, even there may be some time in history, not far away, or maybe it's already there, that the proportion of taxation imposed on a population may be understood in the context of whether it is violation of human rights or not.
Okay.
We may be having that thing in near future. And my right to my basic sanitation, which is an issue in India, may not be in USA. I'm not sure of that. So that is also definitely a human rights issue. So the scope is so vast.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult to define. It covers almost everything.
Yeah, it's very difficult to define. But certainly we could say there are certain rights that all humans are born with, right? But by virtue of being a human being, through an idea of natural law, that our human rights don't come with sort of through what the state gives us, right? There are certain rights that the state gives us, yeah? In Spain, for example, I have a human right every month because I have 3 little children, 3 little boys. I'm happy to get away for a week and a half because they're crazy as can be. Don't put that on camera. No. I have a right every month to 100 euros. By virtue of the fact that I have children, the state, through its civil code and its administrative code, it gives me and my wife every month a little extra money. Now, is that a human right? No, it's not a human right. We can maybe find some elements of it, but human rights go beyond that, right? Human rights are something that we're born with, regardless of whether I'm here in India, regardless of whether I'm in New York City, although now with Donald Trump, who knows? No, but I'm just kidding. Regardless of where I am, every time I come back from my trips abroad, someone always puts a sticker on my door that says Donald Trump. One of my colleagues always does it. Bad people. But they're rights that by virtue of being human, I have, right? It's something as simple as that. We can talk about it in more complex terms, but I think the easy and really the correct way of understanding it, these are rights that I have merely by virtue of being born a human being, right? Now, as we said, that comes from this idea of natural law, right? This idea that through nature, naturally, some people argue by virtue of God, that I have certain rights. Now, that is different from what we could say is a more positivist approach, right? Has anyone heard of that, right? Where the positivist approach, where the rights are given by the state, right? As I said, in Spain, for example, my right to X amount of money every month. My right to a Metro card for transportation. Because I have 3 kids, the government has granted me a right to be able to move around Madrid at a reduced cost, right? I mean, that in itself isn't a human right, because if it were a human right, that would mean that when I come to here, that would follow me, right? Or when I go to New York, the New York City Metro would also be subsidized for me, right? So the idea is that it's a human right is something that follows me, that I have with me. It's a right that I have merely by virtue of being born a human. Now, the question then is where do human rights come from, right? Because they haven't been around forever. That is, if we look back 500, 600 years, the idea of human rights really didn't exist. Let me ask you this. When going back to my example of the Holocaust, which happened, is what the Germans did to, Germans in other countries, did to 6 million people, Jews, homosexuals, gypsies, was it a human rights violation?
Yes.
Was it against the law? Okay, so it was a human rights violation, but it wasn't against the law. But how was it a human rights violation? Was there human rights at the time? What did it violate? Say again? Okay, but did those rights actually exist? I mean, was it something that could be adjudicated in a court?
It was not in pen and paper.
It was what?
It was not in pen and paper. It was not as a jurisdiction, but not jurisdiction, legislation. But it existed.
But could the United States or Britain say, don't do that, it's against the law? Probably not, right? I mean, they could make that argument in a theoretical sense. As you said, I think correctly, was it you? I think correctly so, through perhaps natural law, that, but it wasn't grounded in any type of legislation, in any type of common law. So what we could argue, I would say, and many people I think would agree, is that what happened during World War II was obviously a tragedy. It was unethical, it was immoral, it was terrible. But was it necessarily illegal? Because to be illegal, it has to violate. Come on in. No? Okay, or not. It has to violate certain laws, right? And although I think you're right that perhaps we can make an argument based on natural law theory that humans automatically have certain rights naturally. At the end of the day, there was no justification other than moral or philosophical or ethical that could justify someone saying, Hitler, stop doing that, right?
So they existed, the principles of natural law justice during the 18th and 19th century. In the jurisprudence, it was provided that these theories were...
It provided for some, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There are certain countries in the world, right? For example, the United States, which argued through the Bill of Rights. Have people heard of the U.S. Bill of Rights? Right? That natural law theory gives us human rights. If we look at the Bill of Rights in the United States, freedom of expression, freedom of religion, the right to due process, and the grounding for that, same thing in France, the grounding for that was certainly natural law, right? Is that what you're referring to? But what was the problem? So we talk about the Bill of Rights in the United States at the end of the 18th century. We can argue that's one of the first early human rights documents. Well, what's the problem with that?
There was no consensus among different countries in the world as to
Right.
what shall be human right construed as, what is human rights.
Okay, so and it was human rights for those in the United States, right?
Yeah, for what maybe human rights were in the United States were not necessarily considered in Europe or Asia.
Precisely, there was no universality of that, right? I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And who also was excluded from those rights? Blacks, slaves. So it was human rights, but except for blacks, and except for women.
Yeah.
Women, right? Women didn't get the right to vote until 1919, no, through the 19th Amendment. It's the only reason I remember those numbers. No, many of you, did you fail math? Is that why you're doing law? No? Okay, that was my case. I'm just, I did fail math. But anyway, so same thing. The French Declaration on the Rights of Men, around the time of the French Revolution. Same idea. It applied to the rights of man in France. But that document wasn't, and that was grounded in natural law, right? Many French theorists. Sorry? Well, also the Magna Carta, but that was even before. But the French Declaration on the Rights of Men in the late, 18th century. Same idea. It was grounded in this idea of natural law. But could you take the French Declaration and apply it to Germany? No, right? And that was the problem with natural law or with jurisprudence, right? Is that it was within a country, and it didn't give India or it didn't give any country the right to say, hey, China, you have to apply it, right? So that is the complication, that although we can find seeds, of this idea of human rights, this sort of theoretical concept of human rights, through as I said, the Bill of Rights, the Magna Carta certainly, through the French Declaration. Those were documents that applied to those within the country, and it didn't apply to everyone within that country. So the questions of universality, of equality, even though it talked about that, right? It talked about it in the Constitution. It was equality, but for a few people, right? So that is, I think, highlights then where human rights come from, right? This idea that finally, after the Holocaust happens, the world begins to take stock of the magnitude. 6 million people died. The German government, the Austrian government, the Polish government, they suspend the rights of Jews, homosexuals, and gypsies. And suddenly, mass murder happens, genocide, crimes against humanity. We'll talk about the difference in a moment. And finally then, with the creation of the United Nations, through the people know about the United Nations, through how it developed a little bit, no? We have the Charter of the United Nations, right, which in its preamble talks about preventing the scourge of war, right? The United Nations was created post-World War II, according to its charter, right, to prevent the scourge of war and to protect human rights. So that's where we first get that concept sort of written into stone, this idea of human rights, and from that, we eventually get what's called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was we'll talk about it in more detail in a few moments, but that was the first document, really, that seeks to codify what our human rights are, right? That was pushed by Eleanor Roosevelt. People heard of Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of FDR. And that document, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1946, right, attempted to codify for the first time what our rights are as humans. Me from New York City, or from wherever I am in the United States, you from India, from Rajasthan, from Uttar Pradesh, Andhra Pradesh, wherever you are in this Universal Declaration follows you. I'll tell you, when I lived in India, I used to go every Sunday for a biryani in in Andhra Pradesh, Bhavin, in Delhi. Do you know the Bhavin? What is it? Andhra Pradesh Bhavin, like the house where I used to go to the cafeteria every morning. And I would eat it, and then I would just keep sweating. It was the spiciest food I ever had. No? Have you had food from Andhra Pradesh? Yes. It's very spicy, no? They would deliver these big plates of biryani, but I couldn't. I would lose about, if I would eat 5 pounds, I would lose 10 pounds because I would just sweat it all off, no? So that's the idea of human rights, right? Before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we had rights in India, we had rights in the United States, we had rights in Germany. But the Universal Declaration of Rights seeks to unify that, right? To give us, as men, as women, as transgender, it gives us certain rights that follow us wherever we are. And that is the beauty of that idea. Now, it wasn't without controversy. Many countries, including the United States, although they pushed for it, were concerned about what rights go in there, right? So when we look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it's quite, we could say, general. It doesn't give us that much specificity. But it begins to at least lay the groundwork for subsequent conventions, what's called the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and then later on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. It begins to lay the groundwork for more in-depth human rights legislation. But what we have to, I think, take away from this moment now is this idea that starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, even though it's not a treaty, it's a declaration, so it may, for those of you who have done international public law, it doesn't have the same strength, perhaps, as a treaty, although it becomes customary law. We'll talk about it in a moment. It nevertheless is our starting point for human rights. Now, the question then is, how does human rights differ from other forms of international law, right? Because when we talk about this idea of international public law, has anyone taken international public law? No? We know that international public law is traditionally about what? It's about the relationship between states, right? And international human rights is different from that, right? In that it's not so much anymore about the relationship between states, but it's about the relationship between states and human beings, right? And that's what differentiates it from other areas of international public law, right? It's about the individual and the state. Now, when we use this term international. Is everyone following me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. If you don't, if I go a little jump, just let me know. How are we doing with time? We're okay. What time do you need a break? In about half an hour or so? Take a 5-minute break? You don't need a break? No? We do. Okay, fine. Fine. Since it's human rights, we can take a vote. We can do a democratic. Well, we'll take a 5-minute break just to decompress a little bit. So we get this idea then with the Declaration of Human Rights, this idea of international human rights, right? Because before we may have had human rights, we may have had semblances of it, I think as you say, in the Bill of Rights, in the Declaration of Man, but now we have international human rights as a subfield of international public law. What makes it international human rights? Yeah, the universality of it, right? Is that it's human rights, but it's based on an international document, right? Some sort of international norm. Because we can have human rights, and I think that's maybe what you were referring to. We can have human rights at a state level, right? Through the Bill of Rights in the United States, I had a human right to freedom of expression, but it wasn't an international human right. You see that difference? But through the codification of international legislation and jurisprudence, we get an international human right. Okay, so that's one area. So we have this new field of international human rights starting around 1946, 1947. We have the traditional international public law, yeah, which has been around for centuries, really. The relationship between states. And then we also have another interconnected field that I think is worth mentioning, which is international criminal law. How does international criminal law relate to international human rights law? Can you be guilty of an international human rights violation? But guilty tends to denote a criminal element, right? And are human rights violations criminal? Well, they're criminal if they're found in, some sort of criminal code, right? But could you have a human rights violation that isn't a criminal act? Absolutely, right? Right? So there's a difference there. So just because we violate human rights doesn't mean that we necessarily incur criminal liability, right? Certainly if someone's life is taken away, well, then it's criminal. It's a human rights violation on one hand, but it's also criminal on the other hand, right? So we can't totally think of this idea of you're guilty of a human rights violation. The government may be liable for violating human rights, but it's not necessarily criminally liable, right? For criminality of an international scale, we need to look at international criminal law, right? Which is another subfield, a relatively new subfield, yeah? So, international human rights, international criminal law. How does international criminal law differ from international human rights law? Sorry?
International criminal law is providing liability.
Okay, so
that human right is providing some right to the individual.
okay, good. So human rights, as we said, is between the state and the individual. Criminal law is about imposing, through international sanction, right, criminal violation or criminal culpability on an individual. Does it apply to the state? Can the United States, or right now, the International Criminal Court is looking at international criminal law violations in the United Kingdom. Can the International Criminal Court in The Hague in Holland, can it try the country of the United Kingdom?
Individually. Only the individual.
Individually, right? Individually, you're referring to the person. Yeah. So international criminal law is about imposing criminal liability on an individual, right? So whereas international human rights law is about imposing liability on the state, right? That is when there's a violation here in India, for example. Are there human rights violations here in India? Yeah. No? The same as in everywhere else in the world. Yeah. So there is, right? But do you, when you sue someone for a human rights violation, do you sue the state or do you sue the individual? The state, right? It's always the state, right? Adam versus Bihar, for example, right? Would that be an example? Bihar, is that the state? Okay, so that. Okay, so that. Right. Okay, so that would be an example. But in the case of international criminal law, it's the prosecutor versus the individual, the defendant, right? Now, when in international criminal law, when we prosecute someone for, because we're not suing them, we're prosecuting them. When we prosecute them for international criminal law violation, is it based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or a human rights treaty? No. What's it based on? The Rome Statute, exactly. It's based on a criminal law statute. Yeah? Is that a question? Okay. Yeah, everyone see that difference? So, human rights law, we're using a set of treaties, human rights treaties, which we'll talk about in a moment, and it's imposing liability on the state. International criminal law is about imposing criminal liability on an individual based on the Rome Statute. Is that clear? Where was the Rome Statute signed? Anyone know? Huh? Where do you think the Rome Statute was signed? Rome. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. They love to do that. They always put the name of the place. Like we'll talk tomorrow about the Maputo Protocol. Maputo was in Mozambique. So anyway, that just I guess it simplifies it. Okay. So now is a human rights violation automatically an international criminal law violation? No. No.
Depends on the seriousness of the crime.
Exactly. It depends on the seriousness of the crime, precisely. Yeah, so if I violate, or let's say I'm the state of India, you're protesting, and I tell you, you can't protest on this road. Does that rise to criminal liability? No, no. So under criminal liability, and we'll just talk about criminal liability for a few minutes, then we'll forget about it for the rest of this week. There are only 3 instances when we have criminal liability under the Rome Statute. One is for crimes against humanity. The other is for genocide. And the third is what? Did I say that?
War crimes, crime against humanity, and genocide.
And genocide, exactly. War crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, right? There's also what's called the crime of aggression, but it hasn't yet, it hasn't come into effect. So war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. Those are the 3 instances when a human rights violation can become an international criminal law violation, right? Now, I don't want to go into detail about what each one is. Everyone's getting? Am I going too quickly for anyone? No, I'm sorry. I thought I had a board to write on. I'll ask for one maybe tomorrow. I'm sorry, otherwise I would write it. But can you follow me? Yeah. Okay, fine, good. So in international criminal law, as I said, we have those 3. Now, there are certain violations of human rights which could rise to the level of an international criminal law. That is if a country, for example, decides to exterminate a part of the population, forced transfer, widespread acts of sexual violence, genocide when there's targeted acts against 4 groups, racial groups, ethnic groups, groups based on nationality, and religious groups. That is, if I target the Jewish population, or I target the Christian population, or I target for example, in Rwanda, the Tutsis, an ethnic population. Those are human rights violations, and they're also international criminal law violations. But as we know, the vast majority of human rights violations that happen on a daily basis, whether it be here in India, whether it be in Spain, whether it be in New York City, never rise to that level, right? International criminal law really is reserved for the most heinous of crimes, right? Those crimes, again, that are widespread, for example, in Darfur. Have people heard of Darfur in South Sudan, where thousands of women, thousands of people are killed? In the Congo, where over the last 5 years, over 1 million women have been raped. That's generally what we're talking about. In Uganda, in northern Uganda, the Lord's Resistance Army, this evangelical Christian group, they recruited hundreds of thousands of child soldiers. Yes?
wanted to ask that before the Rome Statute came into existence, on what laws were the criminal prosecutions made, like in Yugoslavia or Rwanda?
Yeah, good question. Yeah, I wasn't going to go into it, but I will. So under what happened in, so just to explain, the Rome Statute came into effect in 2002. Yeah, right, July 1st, 2002. Before that, and that created the court in The Hague. Yeah, okay. Before that, as you correctly point out, we have lots of other tribunals, right? We have.
YCTY for Yugoslavia.
Sorry?
YCTY for Yugoslavia.
ICTY for Yugoslavia. It's called the International Court, International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. Yeah. ICTR, same thing. International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. ECCCC in Cambodia to try crimes against humanity. SCSL in Special Court for Sierra Leone because of the crimes against humanity in Sierra Leone. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed. If you go to Freetown, Sierra Leone, you see people with their arms cut. One of the things that people would do, the militia groups, is they would ask, do you want short sleeves or long sleeves? And if you want long sleeves, they'd cut you here. Short sleeves, they'd cut you here. And you see people in the capital who are cut based on that. I mean, it's, so those crimes happened during the 90s, with the exception of Cambodia, which happened from 1974 to 1979. During the early 1990s, there was the, I wasn't going to go into this, but I will since you asked. From in the early 1990s, there was the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which caused lots of genocides, crimes against humanity. And what the United Nations did under its Security Council powers was created ad hoc tribunals, similar to, for example, Nuremberg. Have you heard of Nuremberg? Right? And it created those tribunals in Cambodia, in The Hague for Yugoslavia, in Tanzania for Rwanda, because it couldn't be in Rwanda because of political issues, in Sierra Leone for the Sierra Leone Tribunal. And that posed a problem. From a human rights point of view, it posed a problem. What was that problem that led to the creation of an international criminal court? Jurisdiction it had. There was another problem. For those of you who study criminal law, it violated the principle of retroactivity, right? That is that what these individuals were tried for was based on a statute that was created after the crimes happened. Similar to Nuremberg, right? The crimes happened, statute was created. For Yugoslavia, it's based on what's called, because there wasn't at that point international criminal law, right? The Rome Statute came into effect in 2002. So what we had before was the ICTR statute, the ECCC statute, the ICTR statute, right? And what it did was, the argument was, and many defense lawyers made this case, is that this is a human rights violation, right? Because under basic principles of due process, right, of right to a fair trial, all of which is in our international human rights documents, I have a right to be tried, right, based on law that exists, not law that is created after it happens. Everyone follow me. Have people heard of the principle of retroactivity? I'll just give you an example from California. This is a case that always highlights it, that for me always sticks out. Back, I guess, in the 60s or 70s, there was a woman who was in an abuse, just to highlight, so for those of you who don't know this idea, right? There was a woman who was, she was dating a man, or I think she was just dating him. He was physically abusive, he would beat her. Eventually she left him, and she started dating another man, and she got pregnant. Yeah, one day she's in the park. Has anyone been to San Francisco? Okay. She's in Golden Gate State Park. It's a big park right there, or one of the parks there. And her ex-boyfriend finds her walking with her new boyfriend. She's pregnant. Yeah, I know. I also look pregnant, but it's too much brownie, is what it is. No, I love Indian food. I have to say, you know, my whole life I've been eating Indian food, and just before I came here, I had a tandoori chicken. It's one of the best I've ever had. It's delicious. Anyway, so she was. He found her and he said, you know, yeah, I'm your ex-boyfriend, blah. And what did he do? He threw her on the ground and started kicking her in the stomach. Yeah, what happened? She lost the child, right? He was arrested for assault and battery, right? As he obviously should be. and he was also brought up on charges of murder. What happened? Under the Penal Code of California, right, they didn't have the rights of the unborn child, precisely. So the legislature passed a new law which said that non-elective abortions, right, meaning non-legal abortions, could be murder. They bring him back up on trial, and his lawyers argue violation of retroactivity, right? You created the law afterwards, right? So that's the problem, I think, that's the problem with international criminal law up until 2002 when we get the Rome Statute. Now the Rome Statute applies to all countries that signed it, right? But before that, it was based on individual ad hoc tribunals which prosecuted many, many people. Hundreds of people have been prosecuted. But the problem is, although the United Nations and the courts don't admit it, that it perhaps violates the principle of retroactivity. Okay? Which is, so while trying to get retribution or justice for victims of human rights violations, it also arguably violates the human rights of the defendant. And even if you've committed a heinous crime, you still have human rights, right? Okay? So that's international criminal law. Just last week they had I think it was the last verdict of ICTY for crimes against humanity and genocide. If anyone's interested in international criminal law, if you go to the website of ICTY, it's the last prosecution of the Yugoslav conflict, and then the court is going to close. And from now on, all cases will continue to go to The Hague. Everyone understand? Yeah, everyone follow? Anyway, okay. So that's the idea. Yeah. So anyway, that's the interrelationship between human rights and international criminal law. Most of what happens in the world tends to be a human rights violation, but it doesn't always, in most cases, rise to the level of international criminal law. Okay? They're interconnected concepts, but they're not the same. Okay? Okay. So we talked about this idea of human rights being rights, the rights of man, the rights of man, woman, child, anyone, right? By virtue of being human, you have human rights. So what are some of the common elements of human rights? The first, as I've suggested, is universality, right? That is that human rights are presumably universal. Regardless of who you are, where you are, and so on, they're universal. Now, we'll explore this question more later on, but at least in theory that is the case. The second is that rights are interdependent. Yeah, that is that we have different rights, but rights also interconnect. What does that mean? That means, for example, the right to maternal health. The right to maternal health, what other right is it interlinked with? The right to life, for example. Right? In fact, when I was working for the Human Rights Law Network in Delhi, they just had a really important case. I didn't work on it, but it's called the Laxmi Devi case. Has anyone heard of that? It was a case on maternal health care. It was a woman in Delhi who tried to seek medical attention. She was denied medical attention. She was a poor woman from the slums. She was denied medical attention. She ended up giving birth under a tree, and she bled to death. Yeah, her child lived. Yeah, survived as well. After that, her state, her family, took the case against I think it was the government of Delhi, if I'm not mistaken, and they made the argument that India had to recognize the right to maternal health, because if they recognize the right to life, then the right to maternal health is dependent, right? Everyone understand that? Yeah. So they wanted India to recognize it. Even though it's in international law, they wanted India to recognize that. And in this judgment, I think it was by the Delhi High Court, they declared maternal health as a right because it was interdependent with other rights. Does everyone follow that idea? So when we're making arguments as lawyers working in human rights, we don't only make arguments as sort of separate arguments. Often we make arguments if we want a court to recognize a certain right, even though they should recognize it automatically. But if we want them to recognize it, sometimes we make these interrelated arguments. The right to water. The right to water isn't specifically found in the in legislation. But there is what's called a right to adequate life, adequate standard of living. So that interconnects with right to life, and the argument is quite clear, right? You can't have right to water, you can't have right to life if you don't give right to water, right? So there are these interrelated arguments. The other, I think, this idea of interdependency also, in my opinion, serves to create more rights. That is, we can ask states to recognize rights, as I said, that don't necessarily exist. I always think about something that is eventually coming down the pipeline, that is right to internet. It doesn't exist. There is a right to information, but a right to internet isn't codified. If we were lawyers arguing for the right to internet, what argument could we make there? Thinking about what I just talked about, what could we potentially argue there?
Since it is interconnected, internet is one of the main sources of information these days.
Okay, so one is that we can't have a right to information if we don't have. What else could we say? I think you're absolutely right.
Right to livelihood and living.
Okay.
Because we are
Well,
dependent on...
not right to adequate standard of living.
Yeah, and a right to livelihood, because the banks and
Okay.
various other organizations are dependent on the internet these days.
But right to livelihood, where are you getting that from?
Right to earning, the people again, job employment opportunities are dependent on the
Okay, so right to
Online
work.
business, I think.
A lot of things are dependent on the internet these days.
Well, exactly. Even right to life. I mean, one of the things, at least in Spain, we have a public health care system. You can't. Well, you can because there are still old people in the country, but you almost can't make an appointment anymore with a doctor unless you go online. It's the only way to make an appointment with a doctor. So right to health, it's interdependent with, right? Right to life. There'll come a point in our society where the way that we will buy things will be with our cell phone. Apple Pay, right? The way that we get information. We want to know that the metro line isn't working. The way that we get that. So my opinion is eventually, one day, we'll have to recognize the right to internet. As it becomes more and more a part of our lives, as scary as it may be, it's becoming increasingly interdependent with our other rights. Yeah, everyone follow that? So again, just something to start. We'll talk about it more this next week, but it's something to think about, this idea. Interdependency, that when we make human rights arguments, we make arguments. For example, I'll just give you one more example. What we oftentimes see in Europe, in the cases involving gay rights, usually it's argued on what's called an Article 8 and an Article 14 violation. Article 8 is a right to private life, which we'll talk about when we do LGBT rights. And then right 14 is a right to non-discrimination. Everyone understand that? So those are interdependent rights, right? I have a right to my family, to my private life, and the reason I don't is because, or the reason that it's being infringed is because you are discriminating against me. Everyone follow that? Yes. So again, human rights as interdependent, not necessarily as unrelated. Yeah. Okay. The next is obviously equal and non-discriminatory. Yeah. What do we mean by that? They're equal and non-discriminatory.
So that one law should be made for each and every person, and it should not be different for if you're a man or if you're a woman.
Exactly.
Uniformity involved.
Yeah, uniformity in law, exactly. Equality before the law, right? That we shouldn't have rights for men, rights for women. Here in India, although it's technically not there anymore, but the caste system, right? Is that correct? Right? In different laws. Traditionally, were there different laws for different castes? Yeah. Same thing in the United States. Up until 1965, different laws for different races, right? I mean, when my parents were young, there was a water fountain there was a school for blacks. There was a school for whites. There was a water fountain or a store for blacks. There was a store for whites, right? So that is the idea. That is equality amongst the laws. And then the final component of human rights is that human rights carry or place on the state 3 obligations. Okay? So apart from universality, interdependence, and non-discrimination, the final point is that human rights involve 3 elements. One is that the state has the obligation to protect. Number 2, the state has the obligation to respect. I'll talk about each one. And then 3, the state has the obligation to fulfill. Yeah? Respect, protect, fulfill. Okay, what is respect? Let's start with that one. When we talk about this idea that the... have people done this before? Some people? Is it new for most people? Yeah? Okay. Yeah? More or less? Más o menos, as we say in Spain. Yeah. Okay, fine. This idea of respect. What is this idea that the state has to respect your human rights?
It's more of a negative.
Sorry?
It's more of a negative duty on the state of not infringing upon someone else's right.
Yeah, so it's a negative obligation, right? We can call it a negative obligation. That is, if all of you decide to protest, the state can't bring water hoses and start hosing you down, right? That would be, unless it's really hot. So, when I lived in Delhi, God, it was hot those summers. Who's from Delhi? Some of you? It gets hot. I would look at my temperature gauge at like 12 at night, and it would read like 42 degrees. Yeah. I would wear a shirt like this to work. It was like, my shirt would turn into a human swimming, or into like a swimming pool. It was amazingly hot, and I've never had a heat. In Spain, it gets hot. The thing, I don't know if no one's been to Spain, no? The nice thing about Spain, well, sort of nice, is that in the summer, from about 1 o'clock to 5 o'clock, everything shuts down, and the only thing to do is to take a nap. Has anyone heard of the siesta?
Yeah.
Right? In Spain, we have a concept called siesta. That is.
Bengal, we are very fond of it.
Oh, do you have it here as well? Yeah. Do you not work middle of the day?
No, we do. We fond of it. We are not that we are having it, but we wish we could.
Okay. Now in Spain, we have it. For example, our university closes for about 3 hours midday, so that everyone. I mean, you can stay in your office if you want, but so that everyone can go home and take a nap.
In law, it is not recognized.
Sorry?
In law, it is not recognized in our country.
Sorry?
In law, it is not recognized in our country.
No, in Spain it is. A human right to siesta. It should be.
That's the reason we shifted from US to Spain.
Exactly. Exactly. That is one of the reasons.
Everything depends upon if they interpret it like that.
Yeah. No, we do have the siesta. It is quite nice. My in-laws, for example, they owned a store, and they close down every day from 1 o'clock to 5:30. They go home, they have a big lunch, and then they sleep for 3 hours. It's nice the first 2 days, and then it's like, let's just keep working, no? Anyway, so the first is respect. Yeah, that the government has to not take action on certain areas, right? That is, in my opinion, for example, it can't prevent you from praying, for instance. An example, this is something that came up in New York City, where some individuals who are taxi drivers, they wanted, during 5 times a day, they were Muslim, to pray, right? 5 times, yeah, if I'm not mistaken, right? 5 times a day. So at first, so what does the government have to do there? Not do anything, right? They wanted to do it on the public streets. So what the court said was, no, let them be. Because what they said was, no, they're stopping traffic. In my opinion, I think it was more in Islamophobia, on the part of the state. But the idea is that, no, if the government wants to respect their right to freedom of religion, it has to not do anything. Everyone understand that? No. Same thing with freedom of expression. The way that we respect freedom of expression, or the state does, is by not doing anything. Yeah? Is that clear? Okay, that's respect. Respect. The second is protect. This is something that comes up a lot in European jurisprudence, particularly from the east of Europe. A woman goes to the police and says, my husband, he told me that when he comes home from work tonight, he's going to beat me. What happens? The police say, or he's going to kill me. The police say, ma'am, this is a private matter, it's not our problem. And what happens? She goes home, she gets killed, right? This has happened quite a lot of times, particularly in the area around Romania, Poland, and so on, no? Or Moldova and those countries. So, what happens? The question that's come before the state is, before the court, the European Court of Human Rights is, has there been a violation? And what the European Court has said many times is yes, right? That the government has an obligation to protect, right? It has an obligation. If there is a third party, for example, the government has to protect. We see this question come up a lot when businesses are involved, right? In South America, we have a lot of issues with destruction of the rainforest, the loss of indigenous land, for instance, contamination of water sources because of oil exploitation, for example. All of that, even though it's a private company, nevertheless, the state has an obligation to protect the individuals. Everyone follow that? Yeah. Same thing, for example, when we see when police officers are, for example, torturing, when prison conditions are terrible. The government has an obligation to protect. So it could be protect from its own state, that is when a police officer does or doesn't do something, right? But it can also be from a private actor, yeah? That is when, again, a corporation. We see that a lot in Nigeria. We see this question come up a lot. Nigeria, particularly on the Delta, near the Atlantic, has lots of oil companies. Shell, BP, that are constantly exploiting oil sources. There's corruption, there's violence, there's contamination of water sources, food sources. All of that are human rights violations because even though it's not the state perpetrating those acts, nevertheless, they have a responsibility to protect. What can they do? It could be, for instance, obviously punishing those people who commit those acts, but more than that, it's by not acting through omission. Everyone know what I mean by that? Right? That is that it should create laws. It should create regulations. Maybe it has to create a special committee, train police officers. All of that is what it has to do in order to protect people's human rights. Good? Okay. And then the final one is fulfill. Yeah. That is that the state has an obligation to not only not do something, in the case of respect, but it also has a positive obligation to actually do something. This we see largely when we talk about economic, social, and cultural rights. Yeah, that is. What would be an example? What would be an example? Do you think of fulfill?
Right to food.
Right to food. Who said that? Thank you. Right to food. Precisely. What does it have to do? It's not that it doesn't have to do anything. It has to do something. What does it have to do?
So for instance, in India we have the Right to Food Security Act, which provides for the government providing, say, either food subsidy or certain amounts of food grains to certain groups of people who cannot otherwise afford it.
Precisely. Food schemes, for instance, right? In New York City, where we have about a 20% poverty rate. Imagine, in the United States, we have a 20% poverty rate. In New York City, it's even higher. We're one of the richest countries in the world, and that it has a 20% poverty rate is a total embarrassment. No, but in any case, we have a very large percentage of the population in New York City that lives in poverty, particularly Black and Hispanics, minorities. Yeah. And one of the things that the government of New York City does in order to fulfill its obligations is it gives a credit card. Yeah, and that credit card, it has on it, let's say, $200 a month. And with that, they subsidize food costs. That would be an example of fulfill, right? What else would be an example of fulfill?
Right to education.
Education, right? It's not that it says we don't have to do anything, so we have to actually build schools and build quality schools. Precisely. What else?
Right to shelter.
Shelter, right? Yeah, right to housing. Yeah. Right to healthcare. Precisely. I think one of the big violations in New York, in the United States, is we don't have a public healthcare system. Right? We have a private healthcare system that is extremely expensive. That, for example, the government has to do something. It doesn't necessarily need to give everyone free healthcare, but it has to subsidize those who don't have healthcare. Right? Right to housing. That's another example. Or right to shelter. In the case of Spain, for instance, there are special subsidies available for housing, and there are special homes. I think you have those here in India as well. Do you have like low-income housing? What are they called?
Its name is Ran Basera.
Ran Basera. Okay, fine. Ran Basera.
We call it Ran Basera, where the government built some small house, and many people live there.
Okay, so same idea.
Even the private construction companies also, when they build buildings, infrastructures, two types of buildings are made. One is the high income variety, the other is the low income variety.
Okay.
It is very much compulsory to be provided.
Okay, fine. So it's a similar idea, right? So all of that is this idea of fulfill. Let me ask you a question. In the United States, we have, I think, what is it? It's about 100,000 gun deaths per year. Private actors, not talking about police. Is there a human rights violation? Yes. Yeah. How so?
Gun laws.
Say again?
So people are being killed, so of course there's a human rights violation.
Yeah, precisely.
The right
So,
to life is being
right, okay, but the government's not taking their life. So how is it a human rights violation?
So there are private actors who are not being regulated by the government. Since there are no regulations or any sanctions on who can own a gun and how, how it is to be used. So that
Precisely, exactly, right? That's an example of protect, right? Even though it's private sector actor, the government has an obligation to create. Now, many people in the United States would say it's not a human rights violation. I think it is a human rights violation when you have 100,000 people that died. When in Texas, you can take your guns to class. Any of you have guns with you today? No? Well, in Texas, you can take your guns to class. We sometimes have students from our university that do an exchange program. Actually, with this university, we've had students come here. And we've had your students coming from West Bengal come to our university as well. But when our students go to Texas, we don't tell them ahead of time, just because we forget, frankly, that you're allowed to take a gun to class. So sometimes they sit down in class and they have someone that's next to them with a gun. And we get calls from them saying, I'm coming back to Spain. But yeah, it's perfectly legal. In Texas, we have what's called, they have what's called open carry laws. And that is you're openly allowed if you go to the movie theaters, if you go to dinner, if you walk down the street, you can carry, I think you can also carry a rifle with you as well. I'll give you, just to give you an idea of why this is a human rights violation. My wife is Spanish. We met when she was studying at my university in the United States. And she decided one day just to sort of see if really these gun laws are as lax as they say. She went to Walmart. Have you heard of Walmart? It's one of these big department stores. And she said, I want to buy a gun. And they said, okay, which one do you want? She says, give me, the one that shoots the most. So they were like, okay, we know which one. They take it off the wall. It's semi-automatic. One of these that you can use military style. And they were like $600. And she was like, okay. So she takes out her credit card. She's like, oh wait, do I need to go through a background check? They're like, no, we just need to see your ID. And she said, well, what about a background check? She says, no, we give it to you, then we do a background check. And if there's any problem, we'll call you. This was in the state of Vermont, in the north of the United States. And that's what happened. And she didn't buy it, obviously. I mean, she's not a gun-toting person. But yeah, that was the case. And so just to give you an idea, and that, in my opinion, I mean, it's funny, it's anecdotal, but it is a human rights violation. When you can get a gun, she's not even, at that point, she wasn't even a U.S. citizen, and you can nevertheless take a gun off the shelf and, a big high-powered rifle and walk home with it. It's a human rights violation, in my opinion, because, buying the gun itself isn't, but the fact that there's not more regulation, or really any restriction, nearly any restriction on it. So, anyway, so that's the idea of fulfill, protect, and respect. The government, apart from human rights being universal, independent, and non-discriminatory, they also place on states those three obligations. Okay? Good? Okay, fine. People need a break? Yeah, okay. It's 6:35. They told me we'd take about a 15-minute break. Is that 10, 15 minutes? Sorry? 4:35, that's right. You're absolutely right. Sorry. I stand corrected. So 4:45, 4:35, we'll take a break to about 4:45. Is that about 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Is that good? Okay, I'll see you back in 10 minutes. About this idea, okay, rights obligations. Yeah. In India, the tea is so good. No?
Everything in India is good.
Yeah, what?
Everything is good.
Everything is good. That is true. Everything is good.
Don't dare say anything else.
Everything is great. But I love the tea here. It's, when I was working in Delhi, we used to have a guy that would come every day to bring the chai wala. The other thing that I love about India are the movies, the Bollywood. It's true that when I lived in New York, we had a theater that was only Bollywood, and my wife and I used to go, and we used to watch movies. My favorite, I guess it's not that, it's sort of Hollywood, but 3 Idiots. Do you know 3 Idiots? I love that movie. It was a very good movie. I'm secretly married to Kareena Kapoor. I don't know how you my wife doesn't know either, but neither does Kareena. But no, Bollywood actors. This year in Madrid, I was actually traveling. Otherwise, someone I know had tickets. It was the Bollywood Awards. This year, what is it called? This year it was in Madrid. This past year, it was in Madrid. My friend went, and I was traveling. Otherwise, I would have gone. A few years ago, it was in Las Vegas, and there was a fantastic. If you can find it on YouTube, it was Ashwarya Rai with her husband, I always forget it. Bach, what's his name? And then his father, the famous. The three of them performed together in the final part of the award. Has anyone seen it? It's fantastic. They do a dance together, and it's fantastic. Anyway, okay, that has nothing to do with human rights. But I'm sorry. Right to entertainment, exactly. Right to Bollywood. Okay. Did you get the attendance? She was. Oh, make sure you get on the attendance, otherwise you're done for life. It's not surprising. She does criminal law, and okay. So the question is, well, we talked about human rights from somewhat of an abstract point of view, in terms of what are the obligations, what are the characteristics of human rights. The next question is, where do human rights come from? Yeah, that is, they have to come from somewhere, right? It's not just that I go into court and I say, I have a human right to Bollywood, for example, right? It has to have some sort of legal basis, right? And the vast majority of our human rights are in treaty form, right? Or resolutions or conventions, right? They're in written form. Treaty, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a declaration, what we'll see is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, right? All of those are forms of treaties, covenants, treaties. Now, what's the problem there? So if you've signed that treaty, then you're bound by that treaty, right? I mean, that's the idea, it's a contract. What's the problem then with the case of human rights in treaty form? There's a problem there.
The sanction part is quite feeble.
Oh, which, sorry?
The sanction part, I mean, as against the codified law, it is only in the form of treaty. The sanction part is quite weak.
What do you mean the sanction party?
Like the implementation issue. When we come to the codified law, for implementation there is a sanction. There is a sanction,
Right.
state sanctions. But so far as treaties are concerned, unless it takes the form of a codified law, the implementation is a problem.
Right, well the implementation falls on the state, right? But, I'll get there in a second, but what is the other problem? So if everything is in treaty law, there's an issue there. Does every country sign every human rights treaty? No, right? So that's the problem, right? The United States, it hasn't signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. We're the only country in the world. Before it was Somalia. Now Somalia has signed. Certain treaties only have about 35% signage and ratification. Others are about 80, 90%. North Korea doesn't sign treaties, for example. Many countries in the Middle East don't sign treaties. A number of Asian countries don't sign treaties. So if that is the case, that you can exempt yourself from human rights protection by virtue of not signing a treaty, that essentially defeats the idea of treaties. Everyone follow that, right? So what is the protection to make sure that even if you don't sign a treaty, you are nonetheless bound by that treaty? Customary law, exactly. Customary international law, international customary law. What exactly is that? What is international customary law?
The highest form of standards accepted by
Oh, exactly. Yeah, the highest form is an excellent definition. Yeah, the highest form of standards accepted by all countries, right? Or some obligations accepted by all countries, right? Legal obligations accepted by all countries. So what would that mean? I'll give you an example coming from the United States. United States, up until fairly recently, said that children, people under 18, or minors, could be put to death. Yeah, those that committed certain acts. Yeah. So the lawyers for the defendant minors, made an argument to the Supreme Court of the United States and said, according to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right, an international human rights declaration for children or treaty, they said it says, well, minors can't be put to death. So the U.S. Supreme Court said, we didn't sign that treaty, right? We didn't sign that convention. So the defendants replied, or the lawyers replied, but it's customary law, right? It's in customary law, and therefore the United States is bound by it. Everyone follow that? Yeah. So, yeah. Okay. They're bound by it. Yeah. Now, how does something become customary law? Sorry?
Being followed by a particularly long period of time in continuity.
Okay, so there's two elements, right, for something to be considered customary law. For the state to accept obligation, right? Because remember, and I think as you say, generally speaking, when we talk about human rights, we're talking about something that comes from a treaty, but that states have the obligation to implement, right? Right? That's if I didn't make it clear before, I think you did. The idea is that states have to implement it, right? We'll talk about this in a moment, but most of the time when we're making human rights arguments, we're making them here in India, in the United States, right? We're not going to the United Nations, although we'll talk probably more tomorrow how we could go to the United Nations, but most of what happens is at the state level, right? So with a treaty, if I want to tell the United States, you have to create, or let's pick another country, Uganda, you have to create legislation that is equal for men and women. Well, I'm going to take the treaty concerning women's rights, and I'm going to say, well, this places an obligation on you, and therefore the court or the legislature has to act. Everyone understand that?
So is there any difference between the customary law, customs which are being followed in a particular country, or which is being followed at an international level? How is it different from each other?
Well, I'll get to it. Yeah, give me 1 second. So that's the idea of treaty. But the problem becomes when my country didn't sign the treaty, I can't then go to my court and say, look, you have an obligation according to this treaty, right? I have to use customary law as my argument. Yeah. So the way that I prove customary law is two-pronged, right? Yeah.
State practice and opinion.
Exactly. The first is I have to demonstrate state practice. Yeah. That is that states clearly practice it. Number one, that states sign it. I'll talk about it in a moment. And then number two, that it's not just that they sign it or they pass legislation, but states actually perceive that they have a legal obligation. Okay? Everyone follow that. So how, for instance, going to the case in the United States, and the rights of the child, how did the plaintiff lawyer demonstrate, or how did the lawyer demonstrate that that child didn't have a right to die through customary law? Right? The first is, they said, that over 150 countries have signed the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Yeah? That is state practice. Over 180 countries or 170 countries have laws which prevent children from being put to death. Over 200 resolutions exist that demonstrate that countries are against the death penalty for minors. Everyone understand that? Yeah. So that's the idea of state practice. The second element is opinio juris. Not just that they have the laws, but that they feel a legal obligation. How do we get how do we demonstrate opinio juris? What do you think?
So opinion juris is basically when it is accepted by the states, that it is acceptable for us to continue this practice, and it can be manifested by many ways. One is the state enacting national legislations in its furtherance.
Okay, so one could also be national legislation. That could also be state practice, but it could also be national legislation. That's one. Yeah. We could also, yeah.
Certain judicial decisions, if they're giving any opinions, if any judges are
Precisely.
giving opinions.
Yeah, judicial decisions are a big element of it, right? So we use it to say, look, not only that we have the law, which can be also opinio juris, but that actually those laws are enforced. Everyone follow that? Yeah. What else? It could be diplomatic cables, according to some sources. It could be scholarly writing, for instance. Could be another one. That is, what are scholars talking about? Everyone follow that? That is, people who are leading writers, leading thoughts on children's rights. What are they saying about it? We also have what's called the law of developed nations. Can help to demonstrate it. That is, what are and this is the term that they use. It's not politically correct, but it is the term that they use. What are the most developed nations doing also, right? So all of that, what does the president say on it? What does national organizations say on it? What do the court systems say on it? So all of that helps us to create opinio juris, right? Everyone follow that. So everyone know the term opinio juris? Right? It's a Latin term, right? It's like the judicial opinion, right? That it's actually in force, right? Not just that states sign treaties or that they pass legislation, but they actually implement it as well. And the idea there is if we can demonstrate to a court that the vast majority, that something is crystallized into customary law, that should, at least in theory, take the place of human rights treaties when our country hasn't signed them. Everyone follow that? So that is, I can go to my court in the United States and say, for example, the United States hasn't signed what's called Cedaw, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. Imagine. India has, I'm quite sure. The United States hasn't. No, one of the few countries that hasn't. But even though they haven't signed it, there's the law that's in there, I would argue, and I think many people would argue, is customary law. That is, so many countries have signed it. So many countries believe in gender equality, right? There's that states have to ensure gender equality, right? That's one of the pieces of legislation. So many states have demonstrated that I could take all that and I would have to make a long argument to the court, pages and pages listing all the countries, listing all the acts. There's a lot that you have to do. But with that, I can then make the argument that even if the United States hasn't signed it, the right to gender equality in the law is customary in nature and therefore enforceable. Clear? Okay, so those are our two, again, sources of treaty law being obviously the most powerful because if you sign it, you own it. And then the second being customary law, something that is recognized by all states as being an obligation under the law, even if they haven't, right? It's so widely accepted that it becomes customary law. The term that we use is to crystallize into customary law, right? I think it was you, who was it? I think it was you. No? That correctly said it. Yeah. Okay, good. Questions? Okay, fine. Now, just to give you an idea of how did the right to water become a human right. The right to human water didn't always exist. It's actually relatively new. But similar to how we talked about treaty and customary law, it started really, the idea of right to water started in the 1970s in Argentina, where it was recognized in Latin America, and it quickly began to grow. Right? Many states began to recognize it because in the actual legislation, it doesn't say a right to water. It says a right to life, a right to adequate standard of living. It doesn't specify water as a human right. It's actually water and clean sanitation, right? And I think this is a human right that's quite relevant in the Indian context, no? Particularly sanitation, no? Issue of bathrooms, secure bathrooms, and so on. Anyway, slowly it began to be recognized by countries in their internal legislation. We had, if I'm not mistaken, I think through the American Convention, which we'll talk about tomorrow, they recognized the right to water. So it began to grow. Through parts of Europe, it began to grow. So it began to crystallize into customary law. And then just some years back, through a United Nations resolution, they declared it through the General Assembly, the right to water. Everyone understand that? So it started as just a country thing. It actually, rather than becoming treaty and then customary, it actually became customary before treaty. We could argue. Now, can a country say, we don't accept this as customary law? And then she was like, yeah, they can, right? But in theory, countries are bound by what is customary law. Yeah, everyone follow that? And we get that from the International Court of Justice. Have people heard of the International Court of Justice? Right, where they've laid out that countries are bound by customary law. Now, as I said, countries like the United States. Is it?
It doesn't, when it's activated by some message or something, then...
It's not activated. Oh, what?
There might be some incoming call though.
Maybe, yeah. My wife asking, where are you? Yeah, I teach a course on human rights in China every summer, and there's not a camera like that. There's always a camera on the ceiling that's dark, and you never know whether it's on or not. It's quite an interesting experience. So certain things we don't talk about. Anyway, so that is the idea, right? So it started as local resolutions or local laws. Eventually, most countries recognize it as customary law, and then I forget what year it was. Maybe it was 2006, if I'm not mistaken. It then entered into treaty form or into resolution form and bound the entire General Assembly. Everyone follow that? Okay, so that's just an idea of how. So sometimes it starts in treaty, and then it can be customary, or it can be customary and then go into treaty, right? It could work both ways, okay? All right, so let's talk about what are our most important frameworks. Yeah, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1948. 1948. I said 46 before. It's 48. Is our first international body of legislation in treaty form, although the argument is that it is just a declaration, right? And that itself, even though Universal Declaration of Human Rights is considered customary law, a declaration is arguably non-binding, right? If any of you have taken international public law, right, a declaration is not binding, or at least arguably it's not binding, right? So, but nevertheless, we get there. Our basic human rights. And they're divided into two areas, we could say. One is what we call first generation rights, some people call our civil and political rights, right? And then we have our second generation rights, which are our social, economic, and cultural rights, right? So it has the basics of what these rights are. It's not in much detail, but it has the basics, okay? Now, the idea after that was to create a document that was more binding, right? That was more elaborate. And there was an argument, not surprisingly, between the West and the Soviets in terms of what do we include in this document. What do you think the Soviets wanted to include? What is the Human Rights, the International Convention, after the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, they were going to create a new body of legislation, a treaty. What do you think the Soviets wanted it to be about? Sorry? Who's speaking? Ah, okay. Labor laws. Yeah, exactly. I mean, they wanted to be more focused on labor laws, more on the social and economic rights of man, the right to work, right, all of that. The West, though, United States, United Kingdom, the Allied countries, really, wanted that emphasis to be on civil and political rights, which the Soviets were less fond of, right? At least in what they were saying. They wanted it to be, obviously, on voting rights, on freedom of expression, and so on. In the end, in 1966, we finally get two separate treaties. We get the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Covenant on Social... sorry, there's actually a mistake there. I thought I fixed it. It should be... Sorry. That's a mistake there. The International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Sorry about that. I thought I fixed it. Anyway. So what's contained in this on civil and political rights? What do we have there? Freedom of expression. What else? Right to work?
Right to vote, yeah.
Vote. Precisely, yeah. Self-determination also, yeah.
Right to trade.
Right to...
Trade.
Trade, is that in civil and political?
Livelihood or trade.
Yeah, that's more economic, social, and cultural. Right to form, yeah. That is right to assembly is what it is. Yeah. Right, and right to association. Yeah, those are our civil and political. We'll work with those in a bit. We also then have our social, and, economic, social, and cultural rights. What would be an economic right? Yeah, right to work, for example. Right? Sorry?
Right to religion.
Right to religion? Yeah, that is actually, that falls under civil and political, if I'm not mistaken. I would say it's civil and political. Although it could also fall under, it could really fall under both, actually. Yeah, what else?
The right to equal wages.
Okay, yeah, that could be.
Wages for equal.
Exactly. Part of the right to work is also the right to equal wages, but equality before the law, that is more civil and political. Yeah. Right to education. Good. What else? Property. Excellent. Right to culture, for example. Sorry? Religious practices could be, yeah.
Right to income.
Yeah, I mean, right to work is what it is, yeah. It's not an automatic right to income, but it's a right to work, which includes a right to a dignified income.
Right to family.
Sorry?
Right to family.
Yeah, there is, they can read into it, a right to family, yeah.
So are these covenants binding over all the countries?
Yeah.
So for example, in our country, like right.
Well, it's binding on those that signed it, and then it's customary on the rest.
Right to marriage.
Yeah, right to marriage. Yeah, exactly. What else? Any others? Right to Social Security, for example. Not only Social Security in the sense of when you retire, but Social Security if, for example, pension, if you're pregnant, for example, if you get sick at work, for instance, sick leave, all of that is the type of pension, right? So it covers all of that, yeah. The Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. What is this? Yeah, this is the transversal concept here is this idea of states having to eliminate discrimination, right? It's a recognition that one of the big underlying causes of inequality is discrimination. So the idea of what's called, this is called Cedaw, as it's referred to. The idea of Cedaw is that it that in all areas of women's lives there has to be the elimination of discrimination. It could range from providing equal pay, for instance, to equality before the laws, to, for example, one of the things is that the government has to promote women in the area of education, but also political life, for example, right? So what types of practices are there? In the case of Rwanda, for example, Rwanda has more women in its legislature, I believe, than any other country in the world. Uganda as well has quite a few. Why is that? Because in every district there's one spot reserved for women. That is to try to comply with Cedaw, right? Obviously, promoting women's girls' education, for example.
Positive discrimination theory.
Okay, yeah.
Positive discrimination theory based on...
Yeah, exactly. And that's the case of women in politics, for example, right? Providing spaces for women to...
in the case of Saudi Arabia, the women did not even have the right to vote or to drive cars. So that is also one of the rights I think that should be one.
Absolutely. And not only in Cedaw, but I think even in the regular conventions, it's liberty, right? I mean, so I think liberty, freedom of movement, I mean, all of that, right? What else do we get there? For example, women's health, ensuring that the resources are the same as men's health, for example. All of that. I'm not going to go through each part because you can read it on your own, but that's the idea, that it looks to eliminate discrimination, as it says, in women's lives, ranging from education to politics to health to profession and so on. Okay? And if you notice that we started merely with economic and social rights, and then as we go on, we get more treaties. These are all UN treaties, right? We get more treaties passed by the General Assembly or by the states, specifically because there's an acknowledgement, an ongoing acknowledgement of more emerging issues, right? That women's discrimination, just by having these covenants, these in their own weren't sufficient, that there needed to be more, okay? The next is what's called Katz, Convention Against Torture. This is a convention. If you notice the year, 84. Why do you think this was passed, and why do you think this came about in 84? This had a lot to do with what was doing in Latin America. when there was lots of dictators, and they were beginning to, like Pinochet. People heard of Pinochet? Well, even in Spain, Franco, in Portugal, Salazar, in Argentina. So it's very much linked to that. And we're going to do an exercise on this tomorrow, once you all have your books. But the Convention Against Torture, it deals with a number of things. One is the obvious, right? That it requires states to eliminate torture. But it doesn't just require them to eliminate torture, but it requires the state to codify torture as a criminal law. Because many states, for example Kenya, and this is what we'll look at tomorrow when everyone has their books, they will, for example, if there is torture, you can be charged with assault, you can be charged with a battery, you can be charged with criminal acts, but torture isn't there. And torture is a crime that rises to a different level, right? It's when the state usually is committing certain acts. So it requires countries to provide, to end torture and to criminalize it. But more than that, apart from that, it requires that it has a big focus on institutions. That is that the state has an obligation to create institutions to eliminate torture. Yeah, it could be a human rights commission, it could be a special department on torture, for example, but there has to be in place the institutional framework, not just the legal framework, but the institutional framework to prevent torture. It also has a big component on access to justice, right? That is that if somebody is a victim of torture, they should be able to access the justice system. Yeah, yeah, right? That is, they should be able to receive reparations. The state has an obligation to conduct legitimate investigations. Oftentimes when there's torture, the type of investigation that's carried out is illegitimate. No, it's a sham trial. It's an administrative hearing. The person is free. It places a strong obligation to actually eliminate, to prevent and to compensate for torture. This is particularly, a lot of people, well, there's also one other convention which is linked to this, which I meant to put it on, I don't know why I didn't, but it's a convention on the prevention and elimination of enforced disappearance. Yeah, and that connects with that. Anyone heard of the term enforced? Sorry, I'm sorry I didn't put it up there. I don't know why. There's actually one other one that I'm missing. But anyone know why it doesn't say what is enforced disappearance? Enforced disappearance was something that happened a lot during in Latin America during the Pinochet and the Argentinian dictatorship regimes, where many young people, college-educated individuals who were in anyone, but it happened a lot to young students who were involved in the democracy movement. They were taken in planes, and they were flown out over the Pacific Ocean and dropped from the plane. There's no body, physical. There's no evidence. There's no body, but they've disappeared. And so, forced disappearance is when the government, to put it in sort of simple terms, makes you disappear. Your body is not going to be recovered. There's not any specific information which says you've been killed, but it's clear that you've been a victim of the state. Everyone follow that? So all of this idea of torture and enforced disappearance, it connects. And it provides a right to know. In the case of, I think it's Argentina, and Chile as well, there's a number of organizations called Mothers of the Disappeared. Those Madres de los Desaparecidos is what they're called in Spanish. No, Mothers of the Disappeared. And those are organizations of mothers. Now they're even, I think, grandchildren. No, they're grandchildren. No, well, I mean, maybe grandchildren even. But it's mainly mothers who keep fighting the state to get more information about that information. And what they use is the Convention Against Torture and the Convention on Enforced Disappearance, basically saying the state has an obligation to give us information about our children and to provide some sort of monetary compensation for that person's loss. Enforced disappearance, I mean, it happens regularly still, but it became a particularly common form of crimes and human rights violation under the South American dictatorships. Yeah? So that's the idea. So it's about eliminating torture, eliminating enforced disappearance, and in both cases, providing information, compensation, and access to justice for those who are victims or for the families. Everyone follow that? Yeah. Okay. The next is Convention on the Rights of the Child, what's called the CRC. Now this is quite interesting. So this evolved in '89, right? And what this did was it made it clear that children are not just the subject of, rights, but similar to all of us, the bearers of rights, right? The owners of rights. And that's what's so important about this convention, is that previously children were seen as subjects of rights. But actually what this does is it makes it clear that actually children have rights. Now, what are those rights? The most important right contained in this treaty is what's called the right of, I have it in Spanish, I'm trying to think of English. The best interest of the child. Yeah? Yeah, the best interest of the child. Sorry, I work mainly in Spanish, so sometimes my English is getting worse, I think. So it is the best interest of the child principle, but it is a right. That means, and this is something that we don't find in any other treaty, that when there is an administrative or judicial decision involving a child, has this come in front of, have you had this issue with the best interest principle when you deal with children?
Yeah, we have this, when in custody matters and all this, we always treat this welfare of the child, that's the optimum consideration.
Exactly, yeah.
So I'm trying those cases where this thing comes from.
Okay, yeah, so it's the idea that whenever an administrative or judicial or really any type of government decision is made concerning a child, that child has a right that the decision that's made is in his or her best interest, right? So what would be an example? There's a custody dispute, or a child is taken out of the care of his mother and father because the child is a victim of violence, for instance, right? So the government has two choices, or the judge, right? I can put this child in a protective home, in like a government home, or I can put this child with the grandparent, right? Assuming that the grandparent is able to care for that child, probably what most information tells us is it would be in the child's best interest to stay with a close family member, as opposed to being put in an orphanage. Everyone understand that? So that's the idea of best interest, that any decision, whenever there's two or more possibilities, the government needs to consider what is in the child's best interest. Okay? That's the first. The second is that the child has a right to be heard. Yeah? This is something that oftentimes gets forgotten. But children, whether it's a custody battle, whether it's a case involving criminal action, whatever, the child has a right to be heard. I'll give you an example. About last year I was in, I don't know if anyone's ever heard of Melilla. Melilla is in North Africa, right almost where Spain and North Africa touch. Yeah. And it is it's Spain. It's Spanish territory. If I'm not mistaken, it may have been taken from Morocco at some point. I'm not totally sure on the history of it. But anyway, it's Spain. Yeah. They're called autonomous communities. It's called Ceuta and Melilla. But anyway, they're Spain. Yeah. Anyway, so they have there what are called cities, which are basically temporary refugee camps for people, for refugees. So it's filled mainly with Syrians. Yeah, it's filled with Syrians. Everyone knows about the whole migratory flow from Syria, the whole tragedy that's happening. Everyone knows about that? Yeah, okay. And it was a lot of unaccompanied minors. Yeah, that is minors whose parents couldn't get out of Aleppo, couldn't get out of wherever. They flew them over to maybe Egypt, and then they were trafficked, literally trafficked across the desert, through, Algeria, Libya, into Morocco, and then where Morocco and Melilla touch, there's a border, and they cross over. So we were doing a consultancy for UNICEF, and we were looking at to what extent is the Spanish government in this refugee camp, because it's a Spanish camp, to what extent were they protecting the rights of the child? And one of the big things that we found was this idea of this issue of the right to be heard. We would say, have you asked the children whether they like the food, for example? Something simple, no? Have you asked the child this? They say, why do we need to ask them? They're children. Children have a right to be heard. When they would come across the border, these children, they would always be met by police. We would say, did you interview the child? And the answer was always no, or oftentimes, no, we didn't interview them, they're children. No, children have a right to be heard in police hearings, in administrative hearings, in judicial hearings. Now, obviously, what the convention tells us is you have to take it into account. If you ask my children, would you like to have chocolate every day, they're obviously going to say yes. No? But, again, that's up to the judge or the police to make that decision, to what extent to listen to them, right? To what extent to take into account what they say. Nevertheless, there is an obligation to be heard. Everyone follow that? Okay. I'll just tell you, that was, sometimes you have moments in your life that kind of remind you of why do we work in human rights. And when I was there were a few stories that really sort of stood out. And it also makes you realize oftentimes how helpless you are, in terms of human rights. There are times when human rights, and actually if we have time at the end of the semester, at the end of this next week, I'll talk a little about how you can get into the human rights field. I know some of you are already there, but for those of you who aren't, I'll talk a little bit, just 15 minutes, about some tips for how you work in that, how you can work in that field. But sometimes you feel like you make a difference, and this is just the nature of humanity, and other times you feel sort of helpless. We were writing this memo for UNICEF, and obviously we felt that we were making some contribution. But then you see these things, and you realize, in the grand scope of things, sometimes human rights are, you can do what you can, but there are limitations. And there are a few things there that for me stuck out. One was, while we were interviewing these children, there was a little bit of an earthquake. This was 2 Februaries ago. There was an earthquake. And the children went under their beds. Yeah? Automatically like that. They went under their beds. These were all unaccompanied children. And I said, wow, they know what to do in case of earthquake. And they said, no. They said, they thought it was airplanes coming over to drop bombs, is what it was, yeah? And then there was this one child who was maybe about 8 or 9, he kept following us, and he kept handing us this piece of paper and had a phone number on it. And we said, we had a translator. We said, whose number is that? And he said, can you call my mom? And we said, why? He said, I've been trying to call her now for 4 weeks. She was back in Syria, in Aleppo, which is one of the cities. He said that she suddenly stopped answering my calls. And he said, can you try and call her? Can you try and call her? I don't know why she never picks up my calls anymore. And it's moments like that where you realize, you can do as much as you can do, but tragedies, and particularly tragedies affecting children, you feel helpless in those moments. And then there's one other thing. One of the things that many of the all these children and their families oftentimes were arriving at the borders between Morocco and Spain. So really, they should be allowed, the families, to cross into Morocco, into Spain, right? In fact, the Spanish government has cameras, so it's sort of like the border, then there's kind of a space in between, and then there's the Spanish side. And we were watching on camera all of these families coming over, and the Moroccan police were basically saying to the families, your kids can go, you have to give us all your money, basically. You give us all your money, your kids go, but you have to stay in Morocco. So we were finding all these unaccompanied kids whose parents were in Morocco, trying to basically begging for money on the streets, or selling things on the street, whatever they could do, to try and get over while the kids were over. And the Moroccan government was splitting up these families just because of corruption. There was no other reason for it. And at the end of the day, we were watching it on camera, and we said to the police, can't you do anything? And they said, the only thing we can do is file a diplomatic complaint with the government of Morocco. No, and that was the truth. I mean, as much as there were about 4 or 5 of us there, as much as we all wanted to go over to the other side and say, you have to let these kids in. At the end of the day, it's a sovereign country, and it reminds you of, there are limitations to human rights, right? I mean, at the end of the day, countries have sovereignty. And as much as you can fight, you can go in, I mean, you can tell them that they need to do things, but countries still retain a high level of sovereignty, obviously, and there are limitations. So anyway, it's just something that, just to share. And then the other one is the Convention on Protection of All Migrant Workers and Their Families. Again, this is from 1990, and also it's a response to the fact that migrants are particularly vulnerable, right? That is, migrants that cross borders. Here, I don't know for sure, but I imagine you probably have, at least during harvest season, migrants from Bangladesh maybe that come over? Is that true?
It's not particularly about harvest season. We have migrants from
Okay, well, yeah.
That is the issue here.
Okay, yeah.
But, it's not particularly about harvest season. It's like this migration is for a permanent sort of...
okay.
We have migrants from Myanmar as well.
I mean, yeah.
That's refugees.
Yeah.
Through Bangladesh.
Yeah, okay. I mean, in the United States, for example, also we have quite a lot of migrants. We have some that are there just seasonally. For instance, in certain harvest seasons, we get, there's an additional flow from Mexico, for example, right? In the case of Spain, now the borders are more open, but from Romania. They used to come from Poland, from Moldova, they come and during olive picking season and during grape picking, the wine harvest, they tend to come. They tend to come over, and so what this law does is it ensures that human rights are extended to them, even though they should be anyway through the international covenants and so on. What this does is it makes sure that them and their families get basic labor protections, right? That their children, if they go with them, that they have access to schools, right? They have access to health care, right? And again, it's even though we can find that in other treaties, it places a particular emphasis on that idea that migrants are particularly vulnerable, and therefore there is a obligation. The last one that I apologize, I thought I put on, maybe I don't know what happened, but maybe I didn't save it. Is the covenant on the protection of disabled people or people with disabilities. And again, it's a recognition that they have needs, and perhaps they're needs that aren't so directly specified in the other treaties. I think we could all sort of imagine what that is, but for example, the right for accessibility, right? In public spaces, sidewalks, for instance. The right for protective laws, for example. Access to health care and so on, with specifications towards disabled people. How is this law put into place? I'll give you an example. In New York City, for instance, there's a law that all public, even though they're private, restaurants and stores, they have to be handicap accessible. So there has to be a ramp into every... and one of the things that actually the government does is they contract people who are disabled to go into stores. And if they can't get in, they get sued. Another thing that's done, this is something my mother's friend, she had multiple sclerosis. She was in a wheelchair, yeah? And so she was part of an association. It was really wonderful, where they would go, when you were going to buy an apartment, you have to go in front of a board. You know what I mean by a board? They have to approve your application. You have to show them that you have sufficient financials, that you're an honest person, a reputable person. So what she would do was, she would go for an interview in a building, and then she'd leave, and then someone else would come in. Basically, husband, wife, or whoever. She was disabled, they weren't. Very, very similar financials. They would accept them, but they wouldn't accept her. Everyone understand that? And then what that NGO would do with the help of the government is sue the building. And it's one of the most important, she really did wonderful work there. It was one of the most important organizations, I think, in New York City. And again, it was fulfilling this obligation because the law says, thanks to this convention, and maybe thanks to this convention, maybe not, but whatever the law is there, that disabled people have rights. They have the same rights, equality, the law, and that applies to private enterprises, but also to public, and that the government has to take means to do that. And the way that they've done that is by creating a law that you cannot discriminate against disabled people when buying, or in any place, but particularly when buying apartments. So what this NGO does is it's sneaky, obviously, but again, it seeks to demonstrate that buildings, and they've won. In the spirit of the American judiciary, millions of dollars. There, someone pulls your hair out and you get $5 million. The barber cuts your hair wrong. $5 million. No, in the U.S. we sue a lot. You know what I'm talking about?
Land of litigators.
I'm sorry?
Land of litigators.
Yeah. I mean, just these massive lawsuits. But anyway, that's not. But anyway, so it's a wonderful organization, and again, it corresponds to this idea that New York City passed important legislation protecting the disabled.
Talking about protection of all migrant workers. Like if some country don't have a treaty with another country regarding this, and they have already intervened the migrants, so that country is not liable to produce to accept those migrants. So is there an obligation on humanitarian ground to keep them, or to tell them no, you have to go back?
There is an obligation when it's someone who's applying for refugee status. Right? So you have, right now Donald Trump, I don't know if you've heard about it, he talks about building the wall. You know what I'm talking about? He always has this wall
in India also
that Mexico is going to pay for.
Because there's a Rohingya crisis, that is that from people from Burma, from Myanmar, they are immigrating to India, and now Supreme Court of India has said that no, we are not going to accept them, we are going to send them back again. So the defendant lawyer just argued that we cannot send them back on the ground of humanitarian ground.
Yeah,
Can we do that?
Yeah, that's absolutely. I mean, there is a law against refoulement, right? And that is that the state, if there is reasonable cause to believe that you're going to suffer, persecution and based on different categories, then they can't just hand you back over. That's been one of the big things. Spain as well has had trouble with that. In many migrants coming from Syria, but also coming from sub-Saharan Africa, they've just been giving them back. And they have a right to due process. Now, another thing is, can you build a wall like Donald Trump is doing? And, you might be able to. I mean, I don't know that in itself necessarily violates human rights law. I mean, there are borders and you have a right. I don't agree with him, no? But you have a right to restrict your borders. Nevertheless, when someone comes over based on humanitarian grounds, based on refugee, that you can't automatically. Now, you can put them through due process and try them, right? And have a trial to determine whether or not there really is persecution, or whether or not they're just using it as an excuse for economic migration, right? So in the case, I don't know if it's certainly in Myanmar, for example, there's lots of people who are fleeing to Bangladesh now. Is it the same population coming here? The Rohingya. Did you say Rohingya? Yeah. I mean, in my opinion, I don't think you can ask them to leave. I mean, I think there's reasonable grounds that there's a genocide going on.
That's a complex issue right now. That's a very complex issue to understand right now. Providing the present economic and cultural condition of India.
Yeah.
It's a very complex issue to decide whether they should.
This is debatable, what he's saying, because Bangladesh is a smaller country than India. Bangladesh is accepting them, more or less. But India, if it is economic ground, it's actually very much debatable because we have more resources than Bangladesh.
So it's not about only resources, yes.
It's about their origins. Those are various complex. It is of course arguable.
It's not only that the resources, refugees are only not on the basis of the resources, but cultural background also, because there are very many different cultures. This is a very complex issue at present, which is being at present very debatable issue.
Yeah, I don't, frankly, I don't. I mean, I know what I've read in the news and whatnot. So I don't know, and I don't know the case in India exactly who's applying. So I don't want to comment, on it in particular. But from what I could see in the news. I mean, there seems to be clear grounds for a genocide, right? That people are escaping religious persecution, political, and if that's the case, which I don't doubt, then I think the government has an obligation. Now, yes, it's true that some countries have less, Bangladesh has less resources, and India, obviously. In that case, the United Nations should, through its United Nations High Commission for Refugees, should provide the resources and the assistance, right? The same thing, for instance, when refugees go to Jordan. Jordan has, I think, the biggest refugee population in the world. Over 1 million refugees that live in permanent settlements. They're from Iraq, from Syria, from Palestine. And in theory, at least, and I don't know how much, I'm not an expert on refugee law, but they should be getting assistance from the United Nations, and I'm sure they do. And that would be the case with Bangladesh. I mean, it would be unfair to say, Bangladesh, you have to absorb the thousands by yourselves, because, or any country for that matter, because it's expensive, right? The United Nations should be assisting. But the question of whether or not based on persecutory grounds, the answer is that you cannot refoul. That's the term that the Convention on the Protection of Refugees uses. It's a prevention of refoulement. And that is, you can refoul them, meaning you can, it comes from the French word, right? Refoul or something like that. I don't speak French, but that is, you can hand them back over only once you've determined that there's no real objective threat or of persecution, right? So if you find out that really this isn't a group that's being persecuted, then you can. But otherwise, they have a right not to be refouled. Okay?
One of the main reasons for not accepting them is national security. So we have suspicion that they may be a threat to our national security.
Yeah, I mean, national security can be a justification, but it, again, I don't know the India case, but
we do have the national security threat, because India is the country, I think, presently in East Asia. Indonesia, which country is presently suffering from the threat of the national security, the most suffered country at present. So I think these are very complex issues. Yes, arguments. Yes.
There are issues involved, you know.
Yeah, it's hard for me to comment on. Yeah, it's hard for me to comment on the Indian case because I don't know. But national security could be a justification. I mean, what we'll see when we look at human rights more specifically in Europe is that it specifically says in some of them that certain human rights can be restricted in the case of national security, right? So there is that possibility. Now, the question is, can you? And this is what I don't know, but can you blanketly restrict all migration based on national security, right? Now, if you see someone coming over that poses a national security threat, yes. Another thing is if you say, we're going to close off all our borders to this humanitarian crisis because there's a possibility, that I don't know that you can do. I'm not sure. I'd have to look into it a little
India
more.
is not doing also that.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, never did on the basis of the refoulement to send the entire Bangladeshi refugees back to Bangladesh.
Yeah.
Has never done that.
Okay.
This issue is different and very complex.
Yeah.
So it has got many ramifications which need to be adjudicated and debated.
Absolutely.
Only after that we can comment on that.
Yeah.
But so far India is concerned, it has been over the thousands of years of history of India. It has never supported refoulement. Rather, it is the country where all from the world, the people came and resided over here and make this country of their own. Like this.
No, I don't doubt it. You know much more about it than I do. That way, I don't want to dispute you on it. But anyway, so that's the answer to. We sort of went on to different tracks, but that's the answer about refoulement, that you can't do it without demonstrating that there's no threat. Okay. So those are any questions about these treaties? Yeah.
Is the right to vote in case of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights is essentially a right or duty?
It's a right. You have a right to vote. Is that what you're saying? Are you asking, is it a right or a duty?
Except for the areas where voting is a compulsory duty, or not voting is penal offense. In those places only, or in those countries only, it may be treated as a duty. Except that is basically a right.
Yeah. There's no duty to vote, but there are certain countries which obligate you to vote. Is that what you're referring to? So what the law says that you have a right to vote. Now, a constitution could force you to vote, and that which would create a duty. But that's a domestic obligation. Do you understand? Now, you could argue that a duty to vote is in violation of other rights, right? Do you have a duty to vote here?
No.
Okay. You have a right to vote. Some countries do obligate everyone to vote with the penalty of a fine. You could argue that that is a violation of your right to freedom of expression, because one of the ways that we demonstrate our expression is by not voting. 2 weeks ago we had, I mean this isn't the same thing, but we had elections for dean of our law school. A few people didn't vote, right?
That's why we have added one option here. None of the above. There's no option in our legislation now. That if there are 10 candidates and I'm not opting for any of them, I can go and press the none of the above.
Okay.
That option is there. So it's
Okay.
the way
Yeah.
You don't like Neta, you like Nota. I mean, if you don't like any of the political, which we call Neta, as the political leaders, if you don't like any of them, then you can press the button of Nota.
Okay. Okay, yeah. I mean, no. Anyway, we're going back to your question. So there's a right. You have the right to vote, but the duty to vote in some countries is placed on by the state. Is that to answer your question? Okay.
If there is a conflict between international law and domestic law of a state, then what will be the possible outcome?
International should prevail.
International.
Yeah. When we talk about human rights, international human rights should always trump. Now, we'll talk a bit more about it tomorrow, but then there's always that question of what about culture clash, right? I mean, a typical case that we hear is like the question of female genital mutilation, right, in Africa. We'll talk about it more tomorrow, but how do you reconcile those differences? Or even here in India, I'm sure there are
The death penalty has not been abolished yet, which has been prohibited under the UNIVERSIDAD.
or what about, for example, child marriage? It's been, how long ago?
It's the bottom.
There's still a problem with child marriage here. But how long ago did they prohibit it? Okay, so it's been a while. Okay. But even then, yeah. No. So anyway, we'll talk about that tomorrow, but going back to your question, international human rights law should always prevail over those questions. Now, there are cases when there's possible compatibility. We'll see that when we look at when we look at the European jurisprudence, or how do we, for example, argue that I can't insult someone? Does that violate my freedom of expression? So anyway, we'll talk about those issues. But generally speaking, the highest law is international human rights. International human rights law. In fact, just very quickly, I just want to read a quote to you. This is a case. I'll just quickly. You don't need to take it out if you don't want to. Let me just see. Cases. One called the Charming Betsy case, and then the other one called Paquita Habana. If you do I'll tell you what the reading is for tonight, and you'll find it. And basically, what it tells us is that the United States has clarified in their own jurisprudence, and this is, I think, the prevailing thought, that international and customary law prevails over domestic law.
Sir, has this International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights has been signed by India or not?
Yeah, I believe it. Yeah.
So, but right to property is neither a constitutional right nor a fundamental right, but still it is prevailing over there. So, judging the case, because there are many cases where the right to property was not considered a right. But
here in India.
Yes, in India.
Yeah, I mean, we'll talk about this tomorrow, but that is the problem with human rights, is that there are many rights contained in there. Oftentimes, the states themselves fail to enforce them. And that's just a reality.
Right to property is there in the Constitution 308. It is a constitutional right. It is not fundamental right.
It's not a fundamental right.
It is not a fundamental right.
It is a constitutional right.
Yes, 308. That is what I am saying.
Yeah. Was there another question?
I said that in Packet Habana case, the Justice Gray's opinion was that when any legal resort is not available, then law should be given privilege.
Yeah, but then in Charming Betsy, they go on to say that international law has superiority over domestic law, right? Is that what you're referring to?
But that doesn't mean that the code followed by a nation, the country, that may be overridden by an international customary law or treaty, whatever it is.
Well, when there's a conflict between state law and international law, what should prevail is international law. You don't agree?
So,
it's not about agreement.
Sir, in some countries, international law is followed automatically. Sometimes we have to transform it.
Yeah.
We have to codify it, make laws on our own.
But if that particular subject is codified already in a state law, in a state law, and that particular issue has been addressed in a state law.
Right, but if it's not, let's say, so the idea though is, if there is, let's say, customary law, we're talking about international human rights law, right? In that case, the state shouldn't contradict that right. What is it, that human right? Is that?
No, I think the question is that if a particular issue is addressed in a state law and it is codified, and the essence in the prevailing international customary law is somehow different than how it is being codified in the state law, and if there is a conflict, then what will prevail? And because when the codified law is there in a state, then
I would argue in that case that customary law should prevail.
International customary law.
Yeah. If not, the question is, well, then what is the point of it? I mean, the idea of international customary law.
They have a problem here. And what you are saying is an odd statement. It's an odd statement. That is how it should be.
Right.
That's your idea. What we are discussing here is what is the is situation.
Okay.
Right. The is situation is not what you think it ought to be.
Right.
The is situation is once it is codified, or once there's a judicial precedent, we do not go for international position. We have to stick to that. As a court, I'm saying, we have to stick to that, even though it is not completely in harmony with the international position. That's the predicament for a court.
Right.
So maybe that is the ideal situation, the one that you are arguing for.
Exactly.
Not in existence.
Okay.
Not in practice.
Right.
That particular thing, I think it is addressed in Constitution, that international law will have, kind of effect on the state law in a essence that it can be referred to or considered to.
Yeah.
But
They are
not
referring. Supreme Court is referring
51A, I think.
international conventions and treaties and all that, but still we have the supremacies of the law that is there.
Yeah, that is true. The thing though is in Parliament. Oh, thank you.
51A.
Parliament. Just very quickly, I mean, Parliament in theory should pass laws that. Now the problem
That's
then.
a yardstick, of course. That's
Yeah.
a yardstick, ultimate yardstick.
The problem though is, I think you're clear, is what is a judge to do, right? Should a judge follow state law, or should a judge follow international law? And you know, there's differing theories. Obviously, as a judge, you are bound by the law of India, right? The problem, what I would argue is that as a judge, you should look to, if the law here is to reach an opinion that most closely reconciles Indian law with international law without violating international law, you know. And anyway, so but yeah, it's complicated, and that's what we'll talk about tomorrow. Is really what we're talking about here is sort of the human rights ideal, right? The issue is in implementation, and that's what we'll focus on more tomorrow. Yeah. Just very quickly, I know that
our constitution, that our Supreme Court must be read, must be interpreted in reference to international law.
Yeah.
That is in the Article 51 clearly states that. And Article 51 of Constitution states we should respect the international covenant situation. And for the first time, I think in Vishaka's case, Cedaw was read into that through for Article 51.
But there was absence of statutory
Yeah,
law
yeah.
in that.
But I just
at that time.
I don't want to be.
But once the code is there,
you've been a good audience. Just we can get to this tomorrow. Just very quickly. So, hopefully today again, you got a general overview of what human rights are, how they function, what are the major treaties. Tomorrow, what we'll do is we'll look at it from a number of levels. First is we'll do a small assignment in class where we'll try and understand what exactly these human rights mean. And what we'll do is I'll show you a bit how to research in human rights. We'll look at what are called the general comments. That is, the law itself tells us something, but the comments of the committees which monitor these human rights, I'll talk about that tomorrow, they tell us more. So we'll delve a bit into how do we understand the interpretation of these rights? What really are the obligations? Because if you look at Cedaw, it tells you in 2 sentences what it is. How is a state supposed to understand what it has to do? So we'll look at how do we go from international law to state practice. We'll do that. We'll look at the different human rights review processes. That is, how does the United Nations monitor review? And then from there, we'll split into different jurisdictions. We'll look a bit at how the African system functions, how the European system functions, and then how the Americas functions. And we'll go into each one through a comparative analysis of those. Okay? All right. In terms of reading, if you read basically what I would suggest reading basically, part 1 is more or less what we've talked about today. So if you want to go through it again, you can. Okay? Tomorrow we'll focus more on part 2, and then a little bit of part 3.
So we have to read 139 pages in one night.
Yes. Is that a human rights violation? Read part 2. Part 2. Is that fair? Yeah. Again, do your best to read it. We'll go over it anyway in class tomorrow, so don't get yourself crazy. Do your best to try and go over the material. And yeah, if anyone is confused about anything, we can meet before class. I'll be here if you want to talk about it. I'm more than happy. Or likewise, we can stay after class. Like I said, if people want to continue the discussion, I'm happy to share a chai with you. Not from my glass, but we can each get our own. We can each get our own glasses, and we can sit down and talk more about human rights. I'm here for the next week or so, and I'm fully at your availability, your disponibility. So again, feel free to talk to me, to have a chat with me, and I hope the first day has given you a lot of good information that's relevant, that's interesting, and then starting tomorrow we'll get into the meat and potatoes of human rights. So thank you guys very much, and I'll see you tomorrow.
Thank you, Professor, for today. And those who have not received the module, please note down the pages which sir has already asked you all to take care of it, because you will be getting it tomorrow. It is actually so many pages, they could not make it in on time. Okay. The attendance, as I told you, attendance is mandatory, and tomorrow you can come little early. Those who have not got module, people will be there to help you out to get it, because by tomorrow it will definitely be ready. And you can come at 2, and for the class, I'll take the attendance 5 minutes early, okay, before the class starts, so that sir starts on